Let's see, Tammy Colby.
Present. Good
Kim
afternoon,
Gleason.
everyone.
Yes, here.
Tom Lovett.
Here.
Lyle Jepson.
Here.
Jenna O'Farrell.
Here.
Amara Severson. Gabrielle Lucci. Richard Werner. Heather Boucher. Chair Samuelson.
Present. Thank you. Okay, well, welcome everybody. Next order of business is whether there are any amendments to the agenda. I have two brief amendments that I'd like to offer, but I don't know if anyone else has anything. Okay, hearing none. Both of my amendments are brief. The first one is to add an item after agenda item F to include a discussion and vote on issues to be discussed with the Senate Education Committee. I've been invited to testify next Thursday and have, I'd like to discuss this at the agenda item, but I wanted to add that agenda item so that we could have a very brief discussion on this. I don't want to derail today's special meeting, but it did seem like an opportune time. And then the second is to add another agenda item for the board announcements, because I have a couple of quick requests with regard to our monthly meeting next Wednesday. So I would move to add those two agenda items.
I'll second.
All those in favor, please raise your hand and signify by saying aye.
Aye. Aye.
Any opposed? Okay, the motion carries. Thank you. Next, turning to agenda item B, we have our newest board member, Mohamedou Diop, who is joining us today. And I sent out a small announcement about him a couple of weeks ago, but he was appointed by Governor Scott at the end of March. He is currently the director of the multilingual learner programs in the Winooski School District and a member of the Champlain Valley Education Center Board in South Burlington. Prior to that, he's held a variety of different positions in the field of education, both here and abroad. And many of you may remember him from the presentation that he gave in November 2021, which goes down as one of my all-time favorite board meetings. It was a really, really wonderful conversation that I thought the board had, in large part due to Mohamedou. So Mohamedou, welcome. I'm going to I'm going to administer your oath of allegiance, and then if you have anything that you want to say briefly after that, then you may. So the first is the affirmation of allegiance. Do you, Mohamedou Diop, solemnly affirm that you will be true and faithful to the state of Vermont, and that you will not directly or indirectly do any act or thing injurious to the Constitution or government thereof, upon the pains and penalties of perjury?
I do. I agree.
And the second is the affirmation of office. Do you, Mohamedou Diop, solemnly affirm that you will faithfully execute the office of member of the State Board of Education and will therein do equal right and justice to all persons to the best of your judgment and ability, according to law, under pains and penalties of perjury?
I do solemnly affirm.
Excellent. Well, with that, we'd like to welcome you to the board.
Thank you so very much, everybody. This sets me back to so many instances that I have to join certain teams, but this is one of the biggest ones ever. As I said earlier, if nobody out there appreciate all you do to support our students in our state of Vermont, I, Mohamedou Diop, again, the new member of this board, I am very grateful for all you do and for choosing to be here, just like me. And thank you all for you do. No, one hand cannot clap. As a team, we can do it.
Thank you. All right. Well, moving on, we have our resolution for Patrick Brown, and unfortunately, Patrick is not with us today. I thought we could sort of capture him to hear this, but in his absence, I'm going to go ahead and read it, and then we'll have this mailed out to him so that he can keep it. So this is the Vermont State Board of Education Resolution of Appreciation for Patrick Brown. Whereas Patrick Brown has served with distinction on the Vermont State Board of Education since August 2021. And whereas Patrick currently serves as the Executive Director at the Greater Burlington Multicultural Resource Center and has been the recipient of numerous prestigious awards from the City of Burlington, United Way, University of Vermont, and the Vermont Racial Justice Alliance, among others. And whereas Patrick lobbied to make Martin Luther King Day a state holiday and organizes annual ceremonies to honor Dr. King. And whereas Patrick has made invaluable contributions to the board's work, particularly as a member of both the Independent School Approvals Committee and the Education Quality Standards Committee. And whereas during his tenure on the board, Patrick has been instrumental in facilitating numerous presentations by local educators, administrators, and students that celebrate diversity, encourage equity, and promote inclusion. And whereas regardless of the capacity in which he has served, Patrick is known for his thought-provoking contributions and perspectives. And whereas Patrick is acknowledged for his calm, pleasant, and patient demeanor, his wise and thoughtful input, and most notably, that he is always a professional and a delight to work with. Now, therefore, be it resolved that the Vermont State Board of Education recognizes and commends the service and commitment of Patrick Brown to the state of Vermont, and be it further resolved that his colleagues offer to Patrick their deep appreciation for his many contributions to improving diversity and equity in Vermont, as well as their best wishes as he concludes his service on the board. And this is dated at Winhall, Vermont, this 13th day of April, 2023. The other thing is, historically, we have gotten small tokens of appreciation to share with board members as a thank you. I got a little tripped up over the weekend because I was trying to mail something to Patrick and needed a physical address and not a PO box. So I kind of tipped my hand a little bit and I reached out to Patrick and he refused and said he didn't want anything. And then I said, well, I have money, people have donated. Maybe a good compromise is if there's an organization that we could make a contribution in your honor. And he thought that would be a wonderful idea. So he has requested that our contribution be made to the Greater Burlington Multicultural Resource Center. So thank you all. And I will make sure that Patrick receives notification of that. Okay. So with that, that takes us to public to be heard. And I believe that the subcommittee has placed a limit of 1.5 minutes per person who wishes to be heard. So, Lyle, do you have your hand raised?
Did we need to vote on Patrick?
Oh, yes, we did. Thank you very much. May I have a motion to approve the resolution for Patrick? It's been motioned by Kim Gleason. Is there a second?
I'll second.
All right, seconded by Tammy Colby. All those in favor, please raise your hand and signify by saying aye.
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 All those opposed, please raise your hand and signify by saying nay. Hearing none, the motion is approved unanimously. Thank you. And thank you again, Lyle. So public to be heard, there is a 1.5 minute limit per person who wishes to speak. And I guess, Maureen, if I could have your assistance in helping to unmute people, it is *5 to raise your hand and *6 to unmute.
Correct.
Okay.
And
see
I would ask
someone.
that when a person comes on, if they could identify themselves first and last name, and if they're affiliated with an organization, that would be helpful as well. And once you're done with that, I can start. I have a timer and I can start the timer. So I see one hand. Maureen, do you?
I just wanted
Chair,
to
did you want to recognize 4353 and I can unmute?
And if I could just note that Richard has joined us.
Ah, thank you. Cell phone ending in, was it 54?
4353 has been unmuted. There we go.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes,
Yes.
we can.
Thank you. Nicholas Smith. I am a Milton resident. I sent in comments yesterday as well. And I'll begin, I guess. I know this is only 90 seconds for me to provide public comment. It sounds like I'm the only comment here. I find that really disturbing that I just found an update to the agenda that is only allowing 90 seconds of comment. I understand that maybe that was decided on previously but was not shared, but this doesn't seem like a standard practice from previous agendas. I also have a lot of issues with a special meeting when these, this EQS update was only provided to this board two days ago. I mean, this doesn't give anyone in the public any chance to review the finalized product here. And, again, last night I find myself on the education website looking at memos for the independent school considerations in this, and among other things that were just uploaded last night, with not even with 24 hours before this meeting. I'm not really familiar with the board meetings because I haven't attended many. And I guess with my remaining time, I just would urge the board to review my my letter from yesterday and my comments. And, I'm very familiar with the working group and the directives of Act 1, but I find that this goes well beyond the scope of the EQS. This is really, taking this and prioritizing items that are not education. And I'm really nervous that that's the direction that we're heading. And not only that, as mentioned in my letter, I'm nervous that we're hiding data rather than seeking data that would help us understand the situations that we're in better and actually provide better information moving forward. The Act 1 was formed, under some scanty evidence, in my opinion, and under a lot of testimony rather than, hard data. And I think we're just going to perpetuate that system here. And I appreciate you listening to me, and I am probably out of time now.
Thank you. Are there other members of the public? Because I thought there would be.
I see a number, it appears to be 802-461-6322. Perhaps it's someone just listening in. And I see an Adam Walker.
Adam is our videographer from the Media
Okay.
Factory, and I did unmute 6322, so the *6 would allow them to speak if they wanted to.
All right. Well, we do have public comment again at the end of our meeting today. So I think at this point, not hearing any other members of the public who wish to be heard, we can move on to the next item on the agenda, which is item E, the Act 1 background. Do we have Representative Christie with us?
I'm not seeing that he's in the meeting yet, and we had
We told him
suggested the
12:30.
timeline for 12:30. So I will.
We're ahead of
I
schedule.
know that he's still planning to join us. I'm realizing, Jennifer, that we had warned for a vote, but we didn't at the beginning of the meeting either remove that. And I presume from a procedure standpoint, we want to recognize that decision not to take or call for the vote today. Is that
and I think it's
something
fine,
you'd
but
like
it's
to
still,
do? Or
yeah, I mean, I was gonna, before I turned it over to this subcommittee, I was gonna sort of frame that out, but
would it
that
be
was-
okay to do that?
Yeah, that might be a good
No,
thing to
that
do
would be
now while we're
helpful.
waiting for Coach Christie.
Yeah, of course. All right, so wait a minute. Hang on, please. All right. Okay, so before turning this over to the subcommittee, I just wanted to acknowledge the incredible work of everyone on the committee. Tammy, Kim, Tom, and Patrick have spent days, nights, weekends, holidays, every moment that they can devoted to this important work and getting us to where we are today. I also want to acknowledge the work and tireless support of the Act 1 Working Group. The rules reflect both the thoughtful consideration of and deep concern about ethnic and social groups whose experiences have often been overlooked. These rules create a pathway to enrich everyone's lives to the benefit of us all. And I would be completely remiss if I did not also acknowledge the board's profound gratitude to Maureen Gatiss for her assistance and support, even at 11 p.m. last night when most normal people would be in bed. We would not be where we are today without her, and I'm pretty sure that any expression of thanks here cannot fully capture the depth of our appreciation to Maureen. And then before we get into the substance of our meeting, I also want to reassure members of the board and the public that we will not be voting on this today. Tammy, Kim, Tom, and I are all in agreement on this point. I'm sure that you've all spent some time reviewing the posted materials and that you all have a sense of both the depth and the breadth of these rules. These are important rules, and they're our rules. Thus, it is important that we all have time to review the posted materials and be in a place where we can have an informed discussion before voting on them. Depending on how much progress board members have made in reviewing the materials, I'd like to suggest that the subcommittee lead us through an overview of the rules, and as appropriate and as time allows, we can delve into specific considerations. So I just want to see a show of hands if everyone agrees that this is a good approach. If you agree with that, just raise your hand and say aye, I guess, because I can't see everybody.
Aye.
Hi.
Aye. Any opposed? Okay, hearing none. I think that is what makes sense. And I'll let Tammy and Kim kind of unpackage that a little bit, because I know that they've also spent some time thinking about sort of the cleanest way forward from where we are today. So at this point, I will turn it over to the subcommittee. So thank you.
Thanks. So recognizing that Coach Christie will join us in 7 minutes, what I thought might be useful for us to do here is do a little set the table around sort of how we might proceed with our time today and some of the key issues. And then when Coach Christie, Representative Christie, joins us, he can provide us with some additional context on Act 1. First off, apologizing again for sort of the flurry of paper and activity that went into your email box. You know, this has been an unprecedented experience for the board, and not having the Agency of Education support for the committee, administrative, on sort of the legal end of things. Maureen gets the gold star times a million for all of her help with sort of posting materials, but the committee has been largely operating without sort of the legal support and other kinds of support that most committees have received in the past from the agency. So it makes it's been a little harder for us to sort of stay on top of this. And as you are already appreciated and probably will appreciate more even so today, this is a complicated rule with a lot of moving pieces, and the committee has been very active in seeking testimony and being thoughtful throughout the process with respect to reviewing the recommendations made by the Act 1 working group, as well as technical comments that have come in from AOE, testimony from many, many folks around Vermont and nationally. And so trying to collate and keep track of all that in a working document has been a challenge for us without having outside support. So I apologize for that. We've done our best. So I think, Kim, perhaps in the next few minutes, it might be helpful. We do have a bit of a PowerPoint, and what I thought maybe we could do is we can give you some context around our work. Coach Christie can then come in and talk a little bit about the history of Act 1. He was one of the sponsors of the bill, and I think that's helpful to sort of situate our more substantive conversation around what the committee has undertaken. Kim, Tom, do either of you have anything you want to add to sort of my high-level introduction there?
No, thank you.
Kim. So why don't I share my screen, which always comes, oh, wait, Maureen, you got to give me the power to share here. And I can share with you a few slides of introduction to our work. I still don't think I can share, Maureen.
Should be coming soon.
Ah, got it, okay.
As quickly as these things happen in our.
That's right. That's right. That's right. One of the things I'm going to remind everyone is the minute I share my screen, I can't see you and I can't also see your hands. So if somebody has a question or something, I need you to speak up. Okay. So what we want to do today is we want to talk about the recommended changes to the Rule Series 2000 Education Quality Standards. And this is really the set of recommendations that are coming from the EQS committee. There were recommendations made to the EQS committee by the Act 1 working, to the full state board by the Act 1 working group. Those were presented last spring. We all saw those. We heard our presentation from the Act 1 working group. What the EQS committee was charged with was picking up that set of recommendations and engaging in a thoughtful and engaged process over the past 12 months to consider the recommendations as well as any other changes that would be appropriate, both within the scope of Act 1, but any technical changes to bring the rule in alignment with current policy and practice. So we had a pretty broad charge, but we did start our work with the recommendation by the Act 1 working group. And I can say for myself, and I would ask the committee members to chime in as well, we are grateful to the work by the Act 1 working group and the substance of their recommendations and thoughtfulness in their process certainly provided us a really great foundation on which to build for the work that we've done the past year. Kim, Tom, did you have anything you want to add to that?
No, I would agree with expressing our gratitude really for the body of work we received and the manner in which they went about making sure it was well informed by those with lived experiences as they convened their group. And I think the legislature was thoughtful in what they were requiring of the group that was brought together to consider the recommended changes to standards, statute, regulation that might be necessary to meet the spirit of Act 1. So we were fortunate to have taken on work that had such depth to it in advance of our time.
The only
go please.
The only thing I would add is I also appreciated that whenever we asked for clarification or asked for the background research and scholarship that they used in crafting their recommendations, that they had it ready on hand, and that was also very helpful.
Thank you for pointing that out. They have been terrific partners throughout the process throughout this past year of working with the EQS committee. Their work did not just stop with providing their draft to the full board last spring. So thank you for that, Tom.
Thank you, Tom. And I think importantly, that collaboration that's gone on, and additionally, those were the initial documents that we shared with you because not all of us were here last April, as we had received the extent of their document that were their recommendations, but also their additional guidance. And as Tom mentioned, sort of their narrative setup and scholarship that went along with their work. So those documents that are attached to this meeting, we aren't speaking to specifically, but know that they were foundational to both what we received and how we moved along in our work as well.
So I think before we launch into what the EQS committee did, and again, Coach Christie will join us momentarily, I think it's important that we ground our conversation today in the Act 1 working group's charge, because that is sort of the starting point at which the EQS committee began its work. And the Act 1 working group was charged in statute to recommend additional standards that are designed to increase cultural competency of students in grades PK-12, increase attention to the history, contribution, and perspectives of ethnic and social groups, promote critical thinking regarding the history, contributions, and perspectives of ethnic and social groups, commit schools to eradicating racial bias in their curricula, provide across their curriculum content and methods that enable students to safely explore questions of identity, race, equality, and racism, and ensure that the basic curriculum and extracurricular programs are welcoming to all students and account for parental concerns about religion and culture. So this was the group's charge, working group's charge under statute to make recommendations with respect to standards that would achieve these goals. And so it's within these goals and within those statutory guidelines the EQS committee did its work. Changer.
Thank you.
So let me talk. Is Coach on? I can't see if when he drops on.
I'm not sure that I remember which of us was going with this one, Tammy. But
yep. Go ahead.
Okay. Yeah. Sorry. Well-oiled machined. So just to speak to our process a bit, we were charged back in May with taking on this work and seeing that the recommendations we receive and what we would come out with for the full board was how it aligned with statute and what we would recommend for the work moving forward, take testimony as appropriate throughout. And so we did so. We began our work with a review and hearing directly from the Act 1 working group in May. And then through the summer, we took testimony and focused our work on the definitions, knowing that they are foundational to the remainder of the document to have a thorough understanding of those definitions. There were many new definitions and some altered definitions that had previously existed in the 2014 EQS. And through our work, we also had added a couple ourselves, and we'll get to that a little bit later. In the fall, we took testimony and focused our work on the sections that related to curriculum and instruction. And we heard it from the field on those to ensure that it was clear and that it could be operationalized. So we will again give you a little bit more on that. The testimony in the fall, we also heard from the AOE regarding technical recommendations. Once the rules are open, the rules are open. So we would be remiss to not take on the full scope of reviewing them top to bottom, and we are grateful for the AOE's recommended technical changes. We held a public hearing at the very end of November, and we heard from more than 30 attendees about the importance of these revisions. And there was unanimity in that from all those from whom we heard. And there were some student representing organizations. There were schools that we heard from. There were families. We were fortunate for folks who devoted their time to that hearing with us. All of this continued to inform our work. Late in the fall, we took testimony and focused on to whom the rules should apply. We began our work saying, importantly, are these the right standards? Recognizing moving aside to whom they should apply allows us to focus entirely on the standards. And then recognizing as well that to whom these rules should apply, whether or not and to what extent to independent schools was going to be a different issue. And we took additional testimony on that. We sought legal review. And then we had gone through updates of the rule that would address reporting requirements in what seemed like a more logical way to put those all in one section and to ensure that we were best aligned that we could be to the proposed district quality standards and quality assurance review that the AOE was working on. So that was how we went about our sort of the broad architect of our work for the last 10 months. Maureen,
So I'm noticing that Representative Christie has joined us. So I think this is a great stopping point, and we can introduce Kim. I think you can introduce him.
I would be happy to, and I thank you, Coach Christie, Representative Christie, for joining us. Representative Christie is one of the architects of Act 1 of 2019, and we thought it would be very helpful to hear directly from him regarding the purpose, importance, and legislative intent around Act 1, and who better to hear from than one of the primary architects of the Act. So, Coach Christie, thank you so much for taking time out of your very busy time in the session, very busy time of your day, and joining us to set the stage for us on how we can best understand the intentions of Act 1.
Well, thank you, Vermont State Board, for the invitation to share with you the journey, because it was a journey and it still is. We just had a fire drill, so things are really bizarre. You know, we emptied the State House, okay, and so we just got back in. So here briefly, the experience that I had with House education when we initially presented the bill and really caught everyone's attention, so to speak. So I started off with this question. And I said, you know, fellow representatives, we're going to do a little history check. And I want you to think about the year 1922, following the Second World War. What event in US history strikes you of change and insurrection, racism, abomination? And there was a long pause. And I said, in 1922, in Tulsa, Oklahoma, what is referred to as Black Wall Street was leveled. Hundreds of Black Americans were killed. People flew over that neighborhood and dropped bombs on that neighborhood physically. People were shot in the street. There was armed insurrection. That's what happened in 1922. And I said, that wasn't in my history book. And I want to ask you, do you recall reading that or hearing that in your experience? And there was a lot of just blank. We have had very clear understanding that a lot of things are left out of history books. But when we look at major events in our own collective history, some things need to be there, or at least part of the discussion. So that's where we started from, in talking about, you know, how do we tell the truth to our children? And the importance of telling the truth to our children. It happened. There is no reason for us not to know it happened. And I know from the call, you know, some of my colleague educators have always been of like mind regarding telling the truth to our children. And that's what this is about at the end of the day. And during the rest of the discussion, you know, we just talked about people's lived experience, you know, on the committee, you know, just like looking around, you know, the room here and thinking about the things that we've learned that we didn't know just in the last 5 years, you know, of the American experience. You know, it's amazing that we had women engineers who helped get us through the space program and into the space program. We wouldn't be where we are without them. And did we know that? No. Did we know about the Tuskegee Airmen? Some did, some didn't. You know, I mean, as you go down the list, there was a group of women Army soldiers who fixed the mail system in World War II that allowed all of the soldiers to actually get their mail overseas. And it was a brigade of women that pulled it off. These aren't just anecdotes. These are landmark pieces of history, that going untold and unshared limits the opportunity for our children. I'm looking at my brother Lyle there, and he and I go back a long ways with technical education. Think about those opportunities when those young people hear those stories, see those stories, and go, wait a minute, that looks like my mom, or that looks like my aunt, and this looks like maybe I can do this. That's what this is about. All of them, providing an opportunity for all of our kids. And I've gotten more emphatic about the all as an educator. There was never a question, I think, anyone who knows, that's how I roll, so to speak. And it's taking care of all of our kids. I'll just very quickly share another, piece that helps me stay grounded around this. And it goes back to that lesson I learned long ago around Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And you look at that pyramid, and at the base of the pyramid is safety. And then at the top, there was always this diagram of this individual, and it was non-gendered. It was just this caricature of someone just like leaping, that self-actualization. But the premise is, if any of us aren't feeling safe, the opportunity to get to the top of the pyramid is lessened. So reaching self-actualization is predicated on safety. We have to provide an environment in all of our schools for all of our children so that they can reach their self-actualization. Not ours, not what we think they should be, but what they need to be and what they're capable of. I ran into a page, the 8th graders, and we get a new batch every 6 weeks, new batch, or I should say a new cohort. And I said, so are you enjoying it? I said, yeah, it's kind of cool. I said, so where are you from? She said, oh, Northfield. I said, wow, that's cool. I used to be the tech center director principal at RAVC. And she said, really? I'm thinking of going to take a pre-tech program there so I can learn more about what my opportunities are. That was a direct quote. Learn more about her options and opportunities. That's what we need to be doing in everything that we think about, for our children. It's not about us, it's about them. And it's about us creating a framework in which they can achieve those experiences. I'm just, having some time on the planet here in Vermont, I've seen so many of, I can say, the kids that I had in school doing cool things. The state's attorney in Chittenden County is a Hartford grad. The assistant attorney general has 3 state titles with us. And, you know, it just goes on. It just goes on. And I think everybody on this call has those stories, you know, about kids that they've had, you know, an opportunity to work with and have had that opportunity to share, you know, that gift, you know, of pedagogy. And that's why it is so important that we don't forget all means all. Every Vermont student is under our care. And it doesn't matter who they are, where they are, what they come from, what their stripes. We have a responsibility to give them every same opportunity across the board. And that was the message, and that is the message. It will not change. And I am just you know, honored and humbled to be here with you today and just share the vision and the dream. Thank you.
Thank you.
It's nice seeing you, Coach.
Thank
Hey,
you.
well.
I'm wondering, thank you so much, Coach. That history is so important for us to understand the environment within which this act was crafted and the intentions that the legislature had in passing this important legislation. I'm wondering, does anybody have any questions for Coach? I know his time is somewhat limited, but we're grateful.
I see your name as Kevin Christie, but I hear you are being called Coach. So I'm going to call you Coach. My name is Mohammed. I am the newest board member. I do appreciate your time with us and the all you had to share that led us to where we are. And I do appreciate most you hearing you say all our children, all our students. That means a lot to me. You did not leave anybody out. All of them are under our care. I do really appreciate that part of all you had to say. And thank you for thinking of every single student to succeed in our state and beyond our state. Thank you for sharing all you had to share.
Thank you. You know, at any, it's been a circuitous route to get here, you know, in front of this screen, you know, today. You know, I just got my license back in the mail, and I had one of the most difficult things with that license was to give up my school bus endorsement. And actually drove up until prior to the pandemic. And I never drove in my home district because I kind of enjoyed, you know, like that anonymity of just being somewhere else. And the fascinating piece, again, about all of our kids, the excitement in those folks getting on, you know, the bus, you know, for, you know, was just, you know, fascinating to watch, you know. And the thing is, there was no separation, you know. They all wanted to be, you know, there, heading to school, you know. And that's that piece, you know, that we, you know, we have to ensure and encourage.
Thank you, Coach. And I guess, and I don't think this is putting you on the spot, but I know you've followed the work that the Act One working group had done, and as they were operating under their directive through Act One, and then we on our responsibilities in taking these rules in. They are aligned with the intent that the legislature had in passing that. I'm not asking you for any particular endorsement except to reflect on its alignment with what the legislature intended as they passed Act 1.
I would say yes. And any little hesitation is, as we all know, moving from vision to implementation is always difficult. And it is a process, you know, and it takes a lot of communication and consensus building along the way to get to where, you know, we'd like to go. But as long as the vision is maintained, we'll get to where we need to be. There's a quote that I'll share in closing with you from Congressman John Lewis, and I have the utmost respect for Congressman Lewis to almost die trying to cross the bridge into Selma and then have his life spent doing what we're talking about right now, which is taking care of our kids and our responsibility around that. His quote was, "Little by little, day by day, what's meant for you will find its way."
That is a really lovely sentiment. I'm sorry you need to leave us, but I'm grateful for all the work you do as you are within those walls and elsewhere, and your deep commitment to our students and kids. Thank you so much.
Well,
And
thank you.
last questions for Coach, or shall we send him off to do the good work? Thank you, Coach. And if we've
Thank
got
you.
follow-up questions, we'll certainly put them in writing to you and look forward to your thoughts.
Great. Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
And keep up the good work, guys.
Thanks.
Thanks,
Take
Coach.
care.
Thank you, Coach.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Right.
All right. I think it
I
makes
think
sense to shift back. Should we do that?
Absolutely. And I think I was hitting this one, Tammy, and then you were taking the specific areas where we need change and drawing those out. So, and Tom, please jump in. Should there be anything that we are not saying that we should be that is reflective of our process, or anything you think we've missed, please join us in the conversation. So the basis for our changes as we took in the Act 1 recommendations were aligned with the following categories. Where we made additional edits to their recommendations was such that we were ensuring that EQS was consistent with existing statute. We looked to ensure that EQS was understandable and able to be implemented in the field. We sought to ensure that the technical corrections that were necessary in the AOE's opinion had been considered. Again, back to that, it's opened, we need to consider all. And we wanted to ensure that it was aligned with recommendations from AOE in the field to bring the document into the currently aligned with policy and practice in education. And then finally, we needed to bring it into alignment with the district quality standards that are proposed by the agency and the quality assurance review process, because parts of EQS will no longer be a valid process as they previously existed. So we needed to make sure that these two documents can combine with one another to provide both the standards and the assurances. And we've done our best to make that alignment and ensure that if we see there to be changes based on our changes, that we alert the AOE in that their public comment is open until tomorrow. So I think, Tammy, we're going to turn to you and the next slide.
Sure. So over the next few minutes, we want to provide you just a high-level overview of some of the specifics of the committee's work. Our goal is to, again, provide a framework for discussion. I'm sure that there will be questions and discussion items around everything, all the specifics here, but we wanted to, again, to sort of provide an overview of how we approach our work. So over the past year, the EQS committee's review focused on really 6 parts of the rule. Section 2114, the definitions, and as we talked about in our schedule of work, that was really the focus of our efforts last summer. We spent a lot of time on the definitions because they are foundational to the rest of the body of work. We took a lot of testimony on that from a diverse group of stakeholders. Then section 2120, which deals with curriculum and instruction. This is both content and instructional practice. Section 2124, the reporting of results, is substantially revised to both streamline and clarify what SUSDs and schools should report. Section 2125, we also updated the continuous improvement plan requirements, both to bring those in alignment with other policy and practice and also the DQS and QAR. We have reviewed the recommendations by the Act 1 working group with respect to the effective date. I'll talk more about that in a few minutes. And we also updated section 2100 regarding statutory authority because we needed to pull in reference to Act 1. Those 6 parts I would characterize as sort of the substance of our work with respect to Act 1's requirements, substantive requirements around equity, social equity. Then we also had a second set of considerations, which we're sort of defining as the to whom the EQS applies. Specifically, we needed to respond to a recommendation by the Act 1 working group to extend the EQS to apply universally and equally to independent schools in Vermont. And in the course of that discussion, we considered sections 2110, the statement of purpose, and 2112, the education quality standards. So what I'd like to do is we'd like to talk about these first 6 in some, I guess, a little bit more depth, pause the presentation and open then for discussion and questions around the first 6. And then we can come back to this second 2 around the to whom. We want to separate the 2 conversations today. So on section 2114, these are the definitions. There were really 6 definitions that the EQS committee recommended further substantive changes to what was proposed by the Act 1 working group. And let me say, and again, Tom and Kim chime in here, we took considerable testimony and there was quite a bit of deliberation and conversation around these definitions because they are foundational. And so the 6 definitions that were either new or substantively revised was the definition of ethnic groups. And in the EQS committee's recommendations, we added language to what was recommended by the Act 1 working group to clarify persecution and other inhuman treatment was added to that definition. This was in response to concerns that the definition proposed by the Act 1 working group was not in alignment with statute, where statute named ethnic groups as those who experienced genocide. And this was in response to feedback that we received from our Jewish Vermont community. The second definition, where there were the EQS committee, the state boards committee, made additional recommendations for substantive changes, was the definition of ethnic studies. In this definition, we dropped specific references to individual indigenous tribes, not wanting to exclude or prioritize one tribe over another. And so the language now has just references indigenous Vermonters generally rather than specific tribes. We also expanded the definition to include those who suffered persecution and genocide within and outside the US, again, to align with statute. The definition of ethnicity, we similarly, in the definition that was proposed by the Act 1 working group, there were similarly lists of groups for Indigenous peoples and Indigenous Vermonters. That has now been generalized to Indigenous peoples as opposed to specific tribes. Again, our concern was that our concern was about exclusion by inclusion of a list and not being broad enough. Racism, the definition of racism, the EQS committee recommended to expand the definition to include the words theory, belief, or act. Originally, it was just theory. And I want to elevate the contributions by Patrick Brown on this, who really brought it to the committee's attention that this kind of change was necessary, both to reflect contemporary definitions of racism in the field, but also to define racism as an action, not just a theory. We also added 2 new definitions, a definition of critical thinking. This was based on input from the field, and the definition that was ultimately adopted was initially drafted by the Vermont Curriculum Leaders Association, but also with contributions from the Act 1 Working Group. And the reason for this is the term critical is used in multiple places in the document, and the EQS committee felt that it was important to distinguish critical thinking as a curricular goal from critical perspectives, which may be used as a lens for considering curricular content. And finally, we added a definition of neurodiversity per the recommendations of the Vermont Special Education Advisory Panel, so that it's clear to whom certain provisions of the EQS apply. I will say there were other, I would consider non-substantive changes to some of the definitions of the Act 1 Working Group, but these were really the big 6 where the committee focused its efforts. In section 20, yes, please.
I'm thinking that is, if there are any specific questions on these changes, maybe it makes sense for us to take them now. Or if board members are okay waiting, that's fine.
It might be easier just to quickly go through all of our changes and then just stop the presentation and have a discussion.
And then you can actually see people too.
Then I can actually see people.
All right, so
it's all about
notes and
but if there's an immediate question or concern, certainly let's take it. I can't see, so you have to let me know.
I'll let you know if I see hands.
Okay. In section 2120, curricular content, the EQS committee took testimony from representatives from the field about the changes proposed by the Act 1 Working Group, and really are the focus of the testimony and our deliberations as a committee was getting answers to the following 3 questions. Are the rules written clearly? Do they strike an appropriate balance between offering enough detail to be understood and enough flexibility to ensure application in a local context? And can these rules be operationalized? That is, are they implementable? I think the committee was very concerned in wanting to make sure that whatever comes through in terms of recommended changes were certainly within statutory guidelines, but also provide clear and something that can be implemented in practice in the field. And again, we took testimony from a broad range of stakeholders, including Vermont Superintendents Association and the NEA, School Boards Association, as well as individual superintendents, the Curriculum Association, and many others. And all of that is detailed in terms of our testimonies and detailed in the handouts you received. We did, as a committee, make several minor editorial changes to reflect recommendations by the AOE and other groups and individuals, primarily for clarity, and in several instances on the part of the recommendations made by AOE to bring the EQS in alignment with changes to policy and practice that occurred since last time the EQS was open. I think it's really important that we note that the testimony that we took on section 2120, the curricular content, was universal in its support for the recommended changes by the EQS to the EQS proposed by Act 1 Working Group and the minor changes by the EQS committee. We didn't receive any dissent to the changes that were being recommended. Sections 2124, 2125, reporting results and the continuous improvement plan. We as a committee did some work on these sections over and above what was recommended by the Act 1 Working Group. And the recommended changes really are intended to clarify and streamline SUSD reporting requirements, and be clear in identifying categories for data disaggregation and reporting. It was a little unclear in the previous version, and also was not in step with sort of current federal guidelines for reporting. We also look carefully at the continuous improvement plan, the SIP process, and we align the reporting requirements with the SIP process as identified in statute. We also are recommending changes to section 2126, to align, where to go? To align the SIP requirements with, I keep bumping my mouse, it does that. Okay, it doesn't want me to talk about this slide anymore, with the requirements of the DQS and the QAR that have been proposed. And then finally, section 2128, effective date. The Act 1 working group had recommended that the EQS, the change of the EQS be enforced on adoption. We heard from the field that there's a lot of work to do to get ready to implement these changes. And so the EQS committee is recommending the following timeline for implementing the new rules: that the statement of purpose and definitions be enforced on adoption, but implementation of the full rule would go on July 1st, 2025. So let me just stop there, and we will now open up the floor for questions and discussion. I'm sure there'll be lots, but hopefully that's a good high-level overview to kick off our discussion.
On the implementation date, I'll just add, Tammy, I think we cited specific sections that were inclusive of definition, statement of purpose. I also recognized in looking at it the thousands of times that we have that there is a section on statutory, like federal and state entitlements. Everything up through definitions really either has little change except for the decision on who they apply to. So I think we will be more specific on the final draft with how much of that first part is effective on adoption, because if there weren't changes, that sets the foundational stage so that districts, as they're resourcing the support to effectively implement effective July 1, 2025, are operating from a collection of information that's current. And that was our point in having some of this be effective, to include the definitions initially, as soon as possible upon adoption. Maybe a time to remind people about the process, the ICAR process. We are like, what we will be asking when we ask for a vote is about the document that is the draft that will go to the ICAR, which I you got it, Jen?
I think it's the Interagency Committee on Administrative Rules.
Thank you. And that process, they may give us some feedback. Then there's a formal public comment period. And the final rules reflective of responses to those public comments would need to be considered and submitted for final approval within an 8-month window. So just rules are complicated, and that timeline, no matter how many times we hear it in our job year, is easy to lose track of. So.
Did you want to chime in on anything?
Just a few things that I think are important for the board to realize, that while those 6 definitions were the ones that we did the most work on, there was a lot of discussion, especially early in the definition sections, on a lot of other definitions. And that, for example, the document recognizes that the definition of discrimination is broader than is currently used, and that and we took some testimony on, and why critical thinking became such a key definition. We took some testimony on the use of the word critical, so that it was not seen as endorsing critical race theory or anything like that. You would use critical in that context. So there was, as you look through the document and you see the use of these terms, we tried to take each time it was used in context and see how the definition applied. And again, if you read the Act 1 working group's explanation, they were looking to expand things to be more inclusive, which is why specific lists were were discouraged, and that more broader terms were used. More broad terms, rather.
Thanks, Tom. So in short, we've had a really busy year, and now we're really curious what you think. So opening up the floor. I see Jenna's hand, and then I see Lyle's hand.
Okay, so I'd run the risk, I think I might be really off base, but on 2125, the continuous improvement plan. So that's a mechanism for public schools, right? It says SU and SD. So independent schools don't do that. So is there, I mean, I clearly heard from Coach, I hear, I mean, this is all students in all schools, but then we have part of it that doesn't pertain to independent schools. And I don't know if that needs to be explicit or, and also is this the continuous improvement plan part of this, like the mechanism for evaluation of the whole act being, you know, like what that looks like in implementation at the local level shows up in the continuous improvement plan, whereas independent schools don't do that. So was there any discussion?
There's been a lot of discussion about that. I'll let Tom jump in here too. The SIP is something that's in statute that's required of public schools. So to call it the continuous improvement process, it needs to align with that. And we also have the new statute that covers the district quality standards and the QAR process. So those things by statute are specific to public schools. An open question is to whom might these rules, the open question is, should the EQS be expanded more generally, which would then include them, could then include independent schools in those requirements. I think that's sort of part two of the discussion. But there also is, and Tom can speak far more in depth and eloquently than I can with respect to, there are a number of mechanisms in place already for monitoring and accountability for independent schools. Tom?
Right, I'm sorry, not to cut Tom off, but would that, before, like I'm aware of like what those are, would there be language here like that indicates that it's a separate path for independent schools or not?
Not in the current rule, there is not.
Right.
That section, because there is nothing in statute currently that requires the SIP process of independent schools.
Okay.
And the review process is currently on a cycle that's related to renewal or approval through, and that piece is within 2200, but the ongoing annual reporting, there is one section that we added a requirement that assessments for students attending independent schools on public tuition be reported out through their LEA, SU, SD. They're required to participate, and that's required to be reported. What we noticed or were unable to resolve, frankly, is where that reporting goes to. And so in that it is the SUSD paying the tuition, the requirement that we added was that the student data reporting would come back through the SUSD. And that is what, Tammy, was that in 2124?
2124. It's 2124.
And that really is a requirement of the SUSD, but it's with data that they are required to be getting from independent schools already for their public students.
So I think the short answer, Jenna, is under statute, there currently isn't a requirement for independent schools to engage in the continuous improvement process as defined in statute. And because of that, this section is not, in the EQS, has not been extended explicitly to them. That doesn't mean that we can't have conversations about that and whether or not that's the right thing to do, is a conversation we should have, as well as to what extent is the EQS appropriately regulatory mechanism for doing that. And that starts to fall under that umbrella about to whom the rules apply, which I think we're going to try to table that part of the conversation and just talk about the substance first of the other provisions, but then come back to that. But you raise a good question. Tom, what do you have anything to add to that?
Well, not if we're not, I think we're smart to table that conversation. Jenna raises one of the many parts of EQS that don't apply to independent schools. And I think that was the problem that we saw with the original recommendation that put all independent schools in the statement of purpose that said all these rules will apply to all schools, all approved independent schools and all public schools. The statute says right now pretty clearly who EQS applies to. And that's why there are things in there like continuous improvement plans and teacher licensure and a whole host of other things that don't apply to independent schools. And so those are the kinds of things that will come up in that second conversation, but there's a number of things in there.
Lyle, I think you had your hand up.
I did, and I first want to say thank you for all your work on this, and thank you for considering postponing a vote on this today, because I think I need to digest this a little bit more. And I may be getting a little too granular, but I look at 21-24 reporting, and I think about equity across the system, and I think about accountability, and I wonder if every student will be treated equitably, and I'm just making up town names, not pointing fingers, but from Bradford to Bennington to St. Albans. And when I see things like the supervisory or the school districts can report in formats selected by the school board, sometimes I worry that we're not using a similar format. And then some things are easy to report on. They graduated or they didn't graduate. But then you have others that are social and emotional well-being. Well, is there a requirement for a particular survey? Is everyone getting the same survey? So I want to make sure that this is a wonderful document. I just want to make sure it's implementable and that there is accountability and that all students in all schools are similar in how they report, because there's no way to then say how well they're doing if reporting is different. And probably you've figured all that out already, and I just need to catch up.
I guess I would say I think that's a really good point, Lyle, and I think that may fall in the camp of the striking the right balance between consistency and prescription and implementation in the local context. And we asked that question about that striking the right balance. As I think about even the old EQS, that language that allows reporting in a format that is determined by each local board is an old language and has been there before. What we've sort of added or moved into the same space was how those data should be disaggregated. And so that is more specific. How they choose to report it, I'm just thinking in my old school district hat as a board member, the annual meetings and the annual reports probably do look somewhat different, but there are statutory requirements for what might be in them. And I'm sure regulatory requirements as defined here. And now we've in 21-24 defined what those need to be. I guess how they present it is the how, and I don't disagree with you. Where we would know what those indicators are that are the right tool to use to evaluate SEL, AOE guidance would be tremendously helpful on that. I'm not sure that's a regulatory prescription as much as I'm recalling in 2200 we said, and the AOE will develop a form.
Yeah, I was going to say, Lyle, and I just made a note. Let me go back to Acting Secretary Heather Bushy about this. I believe that there are more detailed guidance out there in terms of reporting on these, that this is sort of the framework, but there is more detail, particularly under our ESSA plan. But let me get back to you on that. And then we could, I think that might be a helpful input into the discussion about to what extent there may need to be more specificity here, because I agree with you, right? We don't want hiding things under bushels.
And I wouldn't suggest people would do that intentionally. I think that there's a
Not
whole
intentionally.
lot, there's a whole lot to do, and everybody's trying to check all the right boxes and do the right
That's right.
thing. And I look at other areas in the document as well, and I focus, because of my tech ed background, on personalized learning plans. And I wonder who's following up at the Agency of Education on our schools actually doing personalized learning plans. And I just go from experience that some do these very elaborate plans and others say, yes, we do. And so I'll leave it at that, I guess. It's just another area that I have a concern around, that I think personalized learning plans are very valuable and very important, but I think schools are doing them in very different ways. And I don't know if that was the intention or not.
While I wonder, and I'm going to take responsibility as well for looking closely at the DQS to see to what extent the new proposed process would have that annual self-evaluation, what that looks like. The DQS itself is more skeletal in its requirements for quality assurance and compliance reporting. But if there's something specific in there that we might want to offer as recommended for them to consider while the public comment period is open, perhaps Tammy and I, with these questions, can take a look at that and offer our suggestions back to them. If it is all going to be residing in guidance, then I think we would want to also have our voice heard in ensuring just what you're talking about, Lyle, that there's sort of authentic ways for self-evaluations to be capturing more than a checkbox, which I'm sure is the intent, but I'm not sure that that level of detail was offered in the proposed rules.
But to your point, I added that to my list, Lyle. I'll check back with AOE on that to see, right? And I think to Kim's point, in the rule, right, being a regulatory framework, I think there's a balance between having the regulatory framework and then the specific guidance that AOE offers, and we want to make sure we find that balance. But let me check with AOE to see if we can get some more clarification on that.
Thank you. And I think it also goes to, basically all the Act 1 needed inserts that are here. How do we make sure those things are actually happening? So.
And I think if particularly, and I think at the end of our time together today, we're going to ask you all to take another close look at what's there to see if you have specific recommendations. I think our mindset was that we were trying to capture what we could by articulating how data should be disaggregated in 21-24, envisioning that data is really powerful. And I know in EWSD, when we were looking at crafting an equity policy, the first thing we had to really do is look at our data despite good intentions to see where there was not actual utilization of things like AP programs in a representative way. And so the data was powerful, and recognizing the lack of it actually happening despite intention. So I think that data piece is really important. We identified and recognized that as a committee, and I think let's take maybe a look, Tammy, too, to make sure, and Tom, that we haven't overlooked something that should be in 21-24, or Lyle or others, if there's someplace specific, that would be great. Thank you.
Jennifer, I see Jennifer's hand, and then I think Jenna.
Yeah, and I just want to point out, Tom keeps getting kicked out of the meeting, so he's not with us, and he's trying to, this is like the third time this has happened, so I just wanted to let everyone know.
Oh, I'm sorry. Are we doing something on our end?
No,
I don't know that. I just wanted to point out that he's not here.
I see.
And I just want to rewind the tape a little bit. I'm not trying to be critical of any of this other than to say this is all important, and how do we make sure it happens?
And we shared that in our work too. So, and I certainly don't mean for any of it to sound defensive, because a fresh set of eyes on the things that we had intended with the body of work, to see where there's other ways that could make that more clear or make sure it captures what was intended. And we're grateful for that feedback. Thank you. I see Jenna again.
Kim, thanks I appreciate what you just said, and Lyle too. Like I feel like I'm sitting in a spot where like I'm pointing out things, but I'm just
No.
I don't want to come across.
We need this. I mean, this is
The whole point of today's conversation is for you to give feedback, but also to get comfortable with the document, right? Like,
right. And
we've
agree.
had the privilege, and I'm going to use privilege, right, of sitting with this in word by word now for 12 months. So we want to make sure that there's time and space for conversation, whatever that conversation needs to be, so people can be comfortable with this committee's recommendations back to the board.
And I think that as clear and crisp as it should be, for implementation purposes, right? Like if things come across a little unclear or not exactly aligned, then it becomes kind of this loose recommendation, rather than like you put like it's a have to. And Lyle, you mentioned the PLPs. So once again, the language in here says all students in grades 7 through 12. So that's not all students. So independent schools do not have a requirement around PLPs. So it's all students in SUs and SDs, right? Like it's not just, and it's not even publicly tuitioned students do not have PLPs. It is not a requirement.
That's right. That's right. Right now, the document is written has not been extended to apply to students in approved or recognized independent schools, because that has not been the case in the past.
Okay.
So if the decision is to extend it, then we will have to go through and update sections of it.
I guess I'm sitting with coaches framework, right? Like I'm totally sitting in a space where I'm like, yes, all students, right? Like, so now I'm reading this of like, if this is all students, it has to hit the independent school audience in a way that it's doable for them, right? Like,
that's right.
Because all students sitting in independent schools aren't doing PLPs, and right, they're
well, and statute doesn't require them to do those. So we have to walk this. We have to sort of walk this line between what statute allows us to extend independent schools and what it doesn't. And we have a second part of our presentation that we can talk about that. Okay. There are a couple different ways to approach that.
I have a second question though for right now. Whatever happened with the AOE's database, right? They were doing their data dashboard and we were waiting on it because it wasn't populated. But I'm just saying, like, before we go into a data discussion around the SEL work, because that was all part of the AOE's data dashboard, just to refresh our memories.
And I recall that they had put on hold the RFP for school climate surveys so that would not be consistent. Oh dear, Tom said the internet is down on his end. And can he call in on his phone?
He said his cell service is down too. So something's going on with the school
this morning, but no. We will do our best. We've set together to really.
But to your point, Jenna, let me go back to the AOE and ask them about the data reporting. But the language that is in there reflects sort of the broad constructs that both the Act 1 group, some of this is already required, right? Not all that's new language. We moved some things around. Some things were added by the Act 1 working group. The Agency of Education was on the Act 1 working group and unanimously, right, and the things that came out of the Act 1 were unanimously approved. So the agency has some buy-in on the items here. To Lyle's point, I think the point you're making here is there enough specificity here with respect to reporting for this framework to be meaningful and operationalized, right? And I think the question I can go back to the agency, and what I think we need to understand is how are those data being required to be reported to the AOE already under our ESSER plan, right, for the feds, et cetera. And so let's start there, and then I can get a clearer answer back to both you, to the full board, and based on that, we may decide as a group that we want to be more specific. Lyle?
And thank you for that. And I hope that people don't feel like we're just trying to slow this process down.
No.
In fact, what we're trying to do is speed it up by making sure that it actually happens.
Yeah.
So that when we have this, it's implementable.
Yeah,
Yeah,
no, I don't think anybody's taking it that way.
And these aren't questions that will take extensive time to get responses on. They're either there or they're not. And whether or not right now, if the language is that school districts can report as they in their own format, we may or may not be able to move that idea that there be a standardized format, but it may be that the guidance that the AOE provides in addition to this is giving them the format that the data should look like. If the indicators, for instance, we did notice a problem. The data reporting now lives in 2124 in our document. And that is not a section that DQS or the Quality Assurance Review proposed rules requires reporting on. So that's a problem. So we are not sure if that is because there has been movement in where parts of the rules existed in EQS since they filed. And like I said, we are going to craft our public comment on behalf of the EQS committee to the agency's public comment section to say, wait a minute, you guys missed something kind of important. A section of EQS is not required for reporting in the DQS and QAR, and that section is basically student assessment or data reporting. So I'm not exactly sure then what's reported, and if it's only because of movement of where that lived in the document, that's fine, and let's get that fixed.
Mohammed?
Thank you. I appreciate all that has been said already in trying to keep a balance in between independent school and public schools. And I was wondering, or maybe I wanted to point out, I find PLP, our personalized learning plans, very successful and highly successful. And I would dare to point out that independent schools already provide PLP plans. But I was also not trying to speak in for independent schools right now, but I was just trying to suggest whether there has been a survey sent out around what PLP or personal learning plans they already have in place. And I don't think I understand what we are all trying to do right here. But I just want to say, I don't think this is going to be a burden for independent schools to be presenting their work around PLP, because it's been found really helpful, and I would always recommend it for many of our learners.
Thank you for that. I think the challenge we have, and again, we can talk about this in part 2 of our discussion, is given the fact that PLPs are not required of independent schools in statute. Remember, the regulations, we have to keep the regulations within the box, right? Which is the statutory box. I think that's one of the things that we would have to sort through in that conversation. So I'm curious, maybe we could back up. We sort of started at the end of the document. Can we maybe go up to the front of the document? I'm curious about individuals' reactions to, at this point, to the definitions. Both those that were proposed by Act 1 and unchanged by the committee, as well as those definitions were proposed by Act 1 and then revised by the committee. Did anyone have any initial reflections on those? Mohammed?
Thanks.
I'm wondering too, and maybe it's just worth a show of hands, if people have had a chance to review the definitions to be able to have questions about them.
Jenna, did you, I'm seeing you not.
Yes, I read them.
I'll throw myself under
Like
the
of my
bus.
questions.
Yeah, I'll throw myself under the bus and say I need more time.
Yeah, no. And I think
I
important-
wasn't pressing for a vote. I was just trying to organize a discussion to see
Yeah.
if anybody had any comments on those. And we could
And
work through the other
particularly-
sections.
I think Tammy too, particularly if there's some additional information we need to get. We spent a considerable amount of time with feedback from many stakeholders and back and forth with the Akron Working Group for the modifications that we did make, and want to make sure if there's additional information that helps people feel comfortable, we're able to get you that information, because the definitions are so foundational and there are a lot of new ones. I will say the definition section, but for the addition of neurodiversity, has not changed in months. So that body of work, each time that we have shared a current working draft and done a quick update for you all, it included those definitions. I think I'm saying with confidence, and because my head is swimming in how many versions of this document we've had, Tom and Tammy check me. I think the addition of neurodiversity happened in the last month and a half, maybe, and otherwise, there were no substantive changes in the definitions since probably October. So just in case you're wondering, that stuff's not new. There are other things that were cleaned up that we did do. And if there are, again, we're going to invite you as we wrap up our time today to get back to us with any written follow-up questions, and give you guys a deadline for that so that we can be thoughtful in getting responses to anything you have that can fill you in where we had taken testimony or heard feedback or have scholarship that can help respond to your question.
Given where everybody is right now and sort of their first review and sort of understanding the big picture here, would it be helpful for us to then move on and talk about the to whom question at this point? It seems like there's been some conversation already percolating around that. Do we want to shift gears? I just want to make sure that we've allowed enough time and space to consider sort of the substantive, some of these other substantive issues. If you had any questions or concerns you wanted us to address initially here. Again, we're not voting today. The idea is just to give it a high-level overview, try to answer initial questions.
And I'll just point out, Tammy, too, that besides the definitions, which is a lot, we spent a lot of time. We also spent a lot of time on the curriculum and instruction piece, and that and the whole instructional strategy section is greatly revised, and what will be considered a minimum course of study has been expanded. So I think those are places that people should spend significant time as well. Besides the definitions, those two we spent a lot of time on.
Agreed. Yeah, if you go to the PowerPoint, what we try to do is give you the checklist of places where we spend a lot of time, so you could quickly go to the document to see where sort of the areas of focus were. Curriculum instruction was 2120. It's bad if I've got it memorized, I think.
I know. 2120.1, 2120.5 were particular. And when we invited testimony around that, it was to hear from the field, to understand its implementability and the other questions we pointed out to you. We actually made very few changes to those sections ourselves, but we wanted to ensure that those that were being proposed, the field felt as though they could operationalize those. And specifically, we heard from the Vermont NEA, the curriculum leaders, the Vermont Curriculum Leaders Association. We, on the broader document, heard from the Vermont Students Anti-Racism Network. A student joined us to share reflections and stories of their view of importance regarding this body of work for students. And along the way, we certainly had heard from all the major associations, school boards, superintendents, principals, independent schools. I'm sure I'm missing folks. The Special Education Advisory Panel came and joined us a couple of times, which was incredibly helpful and helped improve our language in a few areas. So no shortage of gratitude for those who invested their time with us. But fresh eyes are always the best.
Why don't we shift to the second? So we've given you a sort of high level overview of the substance. Obviously, people need more time and should take more time with that. What we're going to ask for is that if people could commit to providing written questions or concerns to the committee by April 24th, end of day, we will schedule a subcommittee, a committee meeting for us to go through all of those and provide written responses back to the group. I think our thought was that will make it easier to get everybody's feedback in one place. Everybody can see everybody's questions. We can get written responses so that everybody can review those, and then we can have another discussion around the substance. How does that feel like for a process for everyone? It should give everybody, 10 days, 2 weekends. I know we got a board meeting next week. You got other things to read, but if we can have written comments, and I think writing it down in terms of questions and concerns, and in doing so, don't get bottled up in having to get the right words or things. Just get your stuff down on paper, and that way we as a committee can go through. We can probably batch some things together, get substantive answers out to people, and that way everybody can see everybody's questions and have time to sit and think with those. Richard, I see your hand. Welcome.
Thank you. Very interesting conversations, but could you maybe, I was going to say I'm the newest member on the board, so I'm a little confused, but it's not all true now, but can you kind of go through the process and what are the timelines and what is going to be the process? And, we had a gentleman on earlier who wanted to comment and wanted more time to look at it. And how does he get about? Can you spend a few minutes just kind of reviewing more procedural stuff than specifics, just so that when you ask that we respond by the 24th, we know what that response, where are the next steps? And because I read through a lot of this, but it's kind of all new to me, and some of it's very confusing. And then, we bounce back and forth a little bit. So could you do that for us, or can somebody do that for me?
Thank you, Richard. Is it okay, Tammy? I'll give it a shot, and then you. This is my third rules process that I've been involved with, so I am going to do my best to capture the timeline as we understand it. But what we are working on is a draft for the state board to approve to move to the ICAR process for filing, and that is a draft at that point still. But this interagency committee on regulation, and something like that, interagency. Jennifer's been helping.
Committee on Administrative Rules.
Thank you. ICAR. ICAR is a preliminary filing, so we get a draft that our state board feels comfortable with, and I'm going to channel John Carroll when he would say we are trying to get it 90% right. So we have taken the last 10 months of testimony and feedback and careful consideration to get to what we think is, I hope, 95% right, as informed as it feels like it is, but that we are taking our best effort to put a draft forward that we think has included consideration of everything we could anticipate. The ICAR process will then make this a formal process, and it goes into that rule process, and there will be a window that's open for public comment. We will hold probably a couple of hearings where we just, as a committee, listen, and we'll try and do those at different times of day, but there will be opportunity for written comment or submitted spoken comment. That when that window is then closed, and it's, Jen, if you can remind me, I think it's at least 4 weeks. 6 weeks, the public comment period has to be a minimum of a certain amount of time.
Yeah, and I don't have that
Okay.
detail. I just know it's
It
like
will
8
be
months start to
ample
finish.
opportunity. And we are recognizing if this gets filed with ICAR in June, it will be over a summer. So we won't want to run up against our longest limit, which means these rules need to be done within 8 months of being started, which 8 months would be from ICAR filing. But we will want to recognize that if they're filed in June, asking for public comment during a window that's only the summer for education folks is not adequate. So what I expect will happen, our hope is we're able to vote on this document as the full board at the May meeting and get it filed with ICAR, and then open the public comment window, which I can imagine, and we haven't discussed this as a committee, but extending through September maybe. Then we must take in all of the feedback we've received via formal written comment, and as a committee, create a spreadsheet that addresses our decision regarding each of those public comments. And then we have a final draft that either incorporates or has explained our response to each of those public comments that comes back before the full board for a final filing with LCAR. Jennifer, what did I miss? Just because we've been through this a few times now, but it's.
Yeah, no, I think you got it. I mean, the point, all of the work that we're doing right now is considered to be pre-work or pre-filing work. And the idea is once we officially open the rule, and officially is, we were filing the proposed draft with the Secretary of State, and the committee would appear before ICAR to sort of discuss the changes that are being proposed. Once that process starts, we're on a very, statutorily defined short timeline of 8 months. So all of this work that's been happening beforehand is really so that we can kind of position ourselves as best we can before we officially open the rule. Because once we open the rule, it's open, and we've got 8 months from the time we start until the time we finish. And in that 8-month period, I know there are, certain timing deadlines by which, meetings need to be warned for public comment. And then I think we've gotten a certain amount of time for written comment. And then you've got a certain amount of time to process the comments. And it ends up being, particularly for these rules, because they are somewhat lengthy, it's a short period of time.
So I guess my big point is if there's something that we haven't thought of or nobody's brought up, and something comes up and all of a sudden Kim or Tammy as the leaders say, oh my gosh, here's something, we still have time to correct it.
That's right. Thank you for acknowledging that. That is in fact the case. And that's the point of as much thorough pre-work as we've been able to do, we've done. But that is the value in what happens in the public comment period. And I think I'm just finding that our first public hearing will be no less than 30 days following the posting of the filed document. And then, the window within which we leave that open is going to, I guess, that is not defined in this process, but we need to recognize that we have to be able to finish within 8 months, which means we need to get the comments back, be able to respond to them, be able to bring them back to the full board, be able to vote out the final document.
So, Richard, this is Tammy. I think the other thing I might add here is that, as you've heard, the statutory process, right, where we do ICAR, we have this 8 months, and it's a rigid process, actually provides a narrow window for public input and public comment, and in some very regimented ways. And the purpose of the committee's work over the past year was to try to actually open the gates so we could get more public comment, a longer period of time to get input on the document. So we've been taking testimony and having public input on this since last May. Before we file with ICAR, because once we file with ICAR, we have a very small window of time that we can get public comment, and a very small window in which we can actually make changes to the document. So the goal has been to have a more prolonged open period of comment and input by the public for the past year prior to filing, so that we didn't constrain anybody's ability to comment and be part of that process, whereas the the formalized ICAR process is quite narrow, defined, and I think is quite limiting for access by the public.
So instead of wasting everybody's time, then, since you folks, it sounds like have been discussing it since last May, I'll probably just want to reach out to one of you and just get a little bit of background on a couple things, but I really appreciate that, and that makes me feel much better. I thought
Absolutely.
when we started today, we were going to be voting on something like this, and it kept me awake all night, so.
Oh, no.
Sorry.
It did keep us awake all night, but we're sorry it kept anybody else awake all night. I do, thank you for clarifying. It is the very first thing that happened, I think, for Jenna and myself when we came on the state board was consideration of a stack of rules that the AOE provided the documents for that literally was like this. It was the rules that surrounded the special education funding and the special ed rules, the 2360. So I am empathetic to the challenge of embarking on something so foreign, a process like rulemaking as a newer board member. So please know we are available for discussion or clarification and conversation, but specific questions, if you could send them to us in email form, Tammy and I can be sure to capture.
I'll send out an email requesting comment and concerns and questions. You just remember not to, and you can send them back to me. Just remember not to apply all, because that would be a violation of open meeting law. And we'll collate those and we'll schedule a meeting of the committee so we can go through each one of them and make sure that we get thoughtful responses back to the group on those. I think it might be helpful for us to shift to part 2 to talk about sort of the question of to whom. Above, I pull up the slides. I think, Kim, you were going to talk us through that.
I
also want to, Tom, I know your internet has been up and down, but I think it would be helpful if perhaps Kim can give a broad introduction, and then there are 2 options that we'd like to sort of have the board think about. And certainly we've talked in our committee, and I think it'd be helpful if maybe Kim, you could talk about option 1, and Tom, do you feel comfortable talking a little bit about option 2 with the 2200 series? I'd appreciate that. Thank you.
I did just want to check to see, given the fact that this was scheduled for a 4-hour meeting, we have a public comment scheduled later. Do we need a break before we go to the next section of the conversation? A brief break, but I'm thinking, should we take a break till 2? We don't need to stay until 4, I don't think, but I don't know, since we said public comment at the end. Jen?
I wouldn't mind having a break until 2.
Fine. Okay, so let's recess until 2.
All right, thanks.
Thanks.
Let me make sure he's back. This is an important thing. Tom, are you back? I'm going to put the slides up.
And then we really won't be able to see Tom, but I can watch the participant list and see if he comes in. There he is.
Okay. So Kim, I think what we discussed is if you can just sort of go over the big picture of sort of the issues around the to whom, and then maybe present the first option that this committee considered. And to be clear, the committee is not making a recommendation on what to do next. This is really a board discussion, but we certainly we as a group have identified 2 potential options. It need not be either one or either or of those options. But wanted to come to the board at least with some ideas. So Kim, if you want to start, then we can shift over to Tom.
I think fundamentally
What
it was
happened there?
important. Oops, I think we went
It's coming back. It's coming back. It's coming back. There you go.
Fundamentally, we, in taking in the rules as recommended from the Act 1 working group and in seeking where they align with statute, we were not able to find the statutory alignment that permitted full compliance of the entirety of EQS for independent schools. So we sort of began from exploring that option, which was presented to us, and moved from that when we weren't able to find there to be sufficient statutory alignment for such a significant departure from current policy. But we did agree with the Act 1 working group unanimously, all of us, that all Vermont students should be afforded an equitable, anti-discriminatory, culturally responsive, racist and inclusive education, and that the Act 1 principles and goals should apply to schools that receive public funding, whether they're a public school or an approved independent school. So that was sort of our foundational coming to consensus among us. Tammy, Tom, did I miss anything there?
No, that's fair.
And the unanimity of the proposal out of the Act 1 working group was on those concepts, and there was one dissenting opinion regarding application to independent schools, and that was the Vermont Independent Schools Association. But I believe that they had similarly captured that their working group had consensus on the Act 1 principles and goals. And I think I'm reflecting that accurately. So we considered and recognized a number of things. There are other statutes that articulate common curricular, school climate, and facilities requirements for both public and independent schools. So 164.9, I believe that one speaks to reporting on students' equitable access in our requirements. 116 VSA section 906, and that speaks to a course of study that is applicable to all public, private, and private, I think the language is public, recognized, approved schools, and home study programs. So the common course of study, that 16 VSA 906 applies to all those groups. And then 16 VSA section 1161, that section of the law addresses student punishment. It captures the notion of hazing, harassment, and bullying being prohibited in all schools, and adopted understanding of disciplinary practices that are prohibited in all schools. And so we acknowledge that those are sections of the law that currently are invoking application to public and independent schools. I will say each of those statutes predate Act 173, which established yet another category. I may get the language wrong, but we used to just be recognized and approved independent schools. Effective July 1 of this year, there will be recognized ineligible to receive public tuition approved schools, and those approved schools that can receive public tuition. And that distinction is related to their ability and willingness to serve students with special needs, and that's effective July 1 of 2023. So these sections of law don't make a distinction on approved independent schools. I just want to make that acknowledgement. And then the State Board of Ed Rule 2200, which is an independent school program approval set of rules. It provides a regulatory framework for independent school approval and renewal. And there exists a possibility that it could include operating and quality standards for independent schools. But that does not currently exist. There are specific areas where if there were to be a change, must be reported related specifically, I believe, to facilities and finances that exists within 2200. There aren't not other requirements in that regard. And then the third one, when describing the duties of Act 1 working group, it required the group to review standards of student performance adopted by the VSBE, and that points to 164.9 and standards for student performance and content areas. They were also required to look at recommendations for statute and rules and regulations. So those are the considerations that sort of framed our discussions around the question of to whom these apply. Did I miss anything, Tom or Tammy?
I don't think so.
I think the only thing I would add to all of that is, and I just want to stress, I think that the committee is quite unanimous in its perspective that the principles and goals of Act 1 apply to all students in Vermont, and I think we heard that from Coach Christie as well. It's the details of how to operationalize that within the existing statutory framework that has been sort of the rub of the issue. And I'll go back. Well, I don't know what just happened there.
I think we had one more slide.
I know we did. It
Okay.
just the minute I bump my mouse, everything goes haywire. I think now it's not. I don't know. I lost it. Okay, I have
Bright side, next month, the only person, or next week, the only person who has to worry about that is going to be poor Maureen and Suzanne watching the lines for us, because we'll all be together in person.
Let me try one more time. Anyway, my point being is that I think there's quite a bit of I think there's consensus among the committee around all being all. The rub of the issue is that we as a regulatory board, a regulatory body, we need to be able to do that within the sort of the strictures of existing statute. An existing statute isn't entirely clear on to us as a group, sort of what is the best and most appropriate way to do that. And so what you're seeing in this conversation is today, and as reflective of the conversations we've had as a group, which is sort of really wrestling with this challenge of wanting to get to this goal, but also then needing to figure out how to do that within existing statute and also in a way that's implementable. And so I just want to provide a little bit of that treetop context before we talked about the options. I hope, is that helpful to everyone? It gets very technical very fast because we're trying to operate within statute. But I think for me, it's always helpful to remember, like, where are we really driving to, and what's sort of the guardrails around what it is we can and cannot do. So let me just stop there. I hope that was a helpful addition. Let me get this back up. So there were two options that the committee has discussed at length, option 1 and option 2. And I think it might be helpful to have Kim talk through option 1 and Tom to talk through option 2, if you two are okay with that.
Sure.
Okay, Kim, you want to go through option 1?
Absolutely. So option 1, and we tried to lay it out the best we could in the memo you all received and is attached in the materials. It would selectively apply sections of the EQS to independent schools approved to receive public tuition. Those sections that were spoken to in that sentence, that I want to be able to read it as suggested as an example of language that might be able to be used to address sections of EQS applying to independent schools that are eligible to receive public tuition, was to say, pursuant to 16 VSA 906, which is the minimum course of study that I mentioned earlier, applies to all public, private, and home study programs, and Act 2019 Act 1, 16 VSA 1161 was the learning environment section of the rules, and that section of the law is there too. Pursuant to all of those pieces of legislation, sections 2113, 2114, I'll read it and then I'll tell you what the sections are. 2113, 2114, 2120.1, 2120.5, and 2122.1 shall apply equally to public schools and approved independent schools that are eligible to receive public tuition unless otherwise noted herein. And those sections, 2113 is federal and state entitlements and / discrimination. Then 2120.1 is instructional strategies, and 2120.5 is curricular content, if I'm remembering correctly the title. of that section. Yep, curriculum content. And then the 2122.1 is learning environment. And that already applies to independent, it already applies to all schools, as does federal and state entitlements already applies to all schools. We put in language that mirrors in this proposed sentence, approved independent schools that are eligible to receive public tuition. There is a bill moving through now the Senate that uses that language. So we tried to say if these were to apply, they would apply to public schools and approved independent schools that are eligible to receive public tuition. And the unless otherwise noted herein is related to the PLP question that Jenna asked earlier. We have the acknowledgement, and I believe in that section, what we put was a qualifier that said public schools would articulate the students' goals in their PLP. So we tried to put that qualifying language in the document. That was our consideration of option 1. It allowed us to be particular about areas of this EQS that are invoked through those sections of law and address it here within the EQS expectations and standards. In my consideration of this becomes an ongoing expectation and would require sort of the setting the stage for the environment once the student is within the schools, not just whether or not they get in the school. So that was sort of the consideration around option 1, and I'll turn it to Tom for the consideration around option 2.
So option 1, right, would be to identify certain sections where there may be where public schools and independent schools appear to be on equal footing in statute, and that the regulation is implementing those sections of statute equally. So that's option 1. Tom, you want to talk through option 2?
Sure. So option 2 takes the approach that we already have in statute to whom EQS applies. And we also have a set of rules, 2200, which we recognize we would probably have to reopen anyways, given the advent of Act 173 and to see how our rulemaking actually looks in action. And in that, in 2200, we would be able to pull over the part that the Act 1 working group clearly said should apply to all students, all Vermont students. And if we also wanted to restate the parts that already do apply to approved independent schools, we could put them in there as well. So it would stay within the current statutory framework. It would meet the goals of the Act 1 group and Act 1 legislation. And it also has significant accountability in that, as you know, in the independent school approval process, there's a site visit, there's the agency looks at whether or not they met the standards for approval. Our subcommittee also looks at whether they have met those criteria. And if they're found lacking in any of those, they're not approved and don't receive public tuition. It's not just that they, if they missed EQS, that they would be asked to improve. In 2200, if they don't get approved, they don't get any publicly funded students. So I think that it has both the same intent and it would have the same outcome that everybody would like without adjusting the regulatory framework.
And we
so 2 options.
Yeah.
two different approaches to trying to achieve the same goal, which is that the principles and goals of Act 1 would apply universally and equally to students who are attending public school and those for whom public dollars pay for them to attend an approved independent school. So there was a lot of discussion on our committee around it. I think the committee's decision was to bring sort of the options to the full board for discussion. There are really different implications with each option for not just sort of how that would be implemented in regulation, but sort of how this intersection between regulating public schools and regulating independent schools would operate going forward in Vermont. And that, you know, we can just sort of name it, is a bit of contested terrain politically in the state right now on other areas. And so I think the committee wants to be very thoughtful about how we achieve that goal, and again, wanted to elevate this discussion to the full board so that that could be a thoughtful discussion. You stop there, Jennifer?
Yeah, so my question isn't even option 1 versus option 2. My question is, pursuant to Act 1, and this is section 1, little I, which is on page 10, duties of the State Board of Education. It says the State Board of Education shall consider adopting ethnic and social equity standards into standards for student performance adopted by the State Board under 16 VSA section 164-9 for students in pre-K through grade 12, taking into account the report submitted by the working group. So the only thing that Act 1 directed the State Board to do was to consider standards, which I'm just going to tell everyone else on the board, I didn't realize that reference to standards doesn't mean education quality standards. They're actually a different set of standards that the State Board applies. And like, for instance, Common Core is a standard that was adopted by the State Board of Ed pursuant to 164-9. So this is a different statutory home, and that's the only thing that Act 1 charged the State Board with doing. So I'm wondering why, and those standards can apply equally to independent and public schools. I'm wondering why we're not looking at the Act, and specifically 16 VSA section 164-9, as the way to implement standards that would apply equally to public schools and independent schools. I understand that the Act 1 working group sort of trained its focus on the EQS, but the EQS is frameworked by 16 VSA 165. And that's where I really run into problems, because 165 is clear that it does not apply to independent schools unless you are an independent school that wishes to be designated as meeting education quality standards. The statute's really clear on that. And if you are an independent school that meets education quality standards, then you get your full tuition and not just the state minimum. So I think we need to be really, really clear about putting anything pertaining to independent schools in 165 that isn't bound by statute, and particularly, I don't see the statutory authority to put 2120.1 in EQS and have that apply to independent schools.
If I could, Kim, I saw your hand. So you'll see in our slides that certainly our committees identified that as a consideration, right? That there is under 164-9 these standards, right, over which the board has. It is true that in Act 1, the Act 1 working group was also directed, it said it could review other state board rules. It did. It reviewed EQS and has made recommendations on that. And, you know, we are considering those. So it seems to me that these are two things, two different questions, right? Which is one, to whom do EQS apply? But it also seems as if under Act 1, there is this call that we probably should be attending to the standards under 164-9. And it's my understanding the Act 1 group is going to be coming back to us with recommendations on that as well. And those, by virtue of 164-9, would apply equally. So I think I'd like to bifurcate the two issues, because, you know, I think we're going to hear more from Act 1 on 164-9 already, the Act 1 working group on 164-9, and we clearly have a job to do there.
Yeah, I'm just wondering.
And I don't disagree with you with, and you'll notice on our slides, like, we did discuss that. I think what you're articulating right now is one of the hiccups that the committee recognized, and you'll see that we recognize that 165 is problematic for applying the entire EQS to independent schools, right? We all agreed that and the committee rejected that recommendation by Act 1. The question is to what extent, since independent schools and public schools are on equal footing in certain other aspects of statute, and those areas of statutes, we have regulation that's embedded in the EQS that's implementing those statutes. I think that's where it gets blurry, and I think that's where the committee has had its most active discussion around these two potential options for how to implement those other aspects of statute.
Yeah, and as far as that goes, I mean, like the non-discrimination federal and state laws, I mean, that language is currently in 2200. You know, independent schools have to comply with state and federal non-discrimination laws. So that, I mean, I think I look at that as sort of parallel recognition of, you know, public and independent schools both being bound by a similar law. And just because that language appears in EQS and it also applies to independent schools doesn't mean that therefore, you know, independent schools got sucked into EQS for that limited purpose. I don't think it has to be that way. I think the way I analyze it is there's an overarching statute, and, you know, both categories of schools have taken that language and applied it to their specific rules.
Yeah, I think the question that's on the table is, we have a bunch of statute that applies equally to independent schools and public schools. And the question then is where does the regulatory framework for implementing that statute live? Does it live in the EQS for both? Does it live in EQS for publics and 2200 for independent schools, right? So I think the intent and the goal of our committee was recognizing that Act 1 principles and goals should apply to all students. Is the question is like, where does the regulatory language that implements those things in a common way, right, for both public and independent schools, where does that live? Does it live in EQS or does it live in 2200? It's not a question of should those principles and goals and that regulatory language not apply to independent schools. It's just where does that language live?
Correct. And I'm not saying that they don't apply. And so really, to go back to my original question, I mean, I only saw this morning that there are going to be recommendations coming from the working group pursuant to 164.9. And I'm curious because, you know, I had thought that maybe that would be a really good place where the state board could craft standards that apply to public and independent schools and take the question off the table about.
I think the challenge is that there are other elements that have been recommended by the Act 1 group that at least our committee feels strongly that needs to apply universally to both independent and public schools to implement Act 1 that go beyond curricular standards that would be consistent with what would be covered under 164.9. I see Kim and Tom's hands. Tom, Kim?
Thank you. Just Jennifer, to the question of their recommendation, it is actually specific in Section 2 in Act 1 that they inform updates to statute regulation related to students' experience and standards. So it wasn't just the standards. I also know that when they joined us to describe the process that brought to bear these recommendations, they did not feel as though they could live independently as a subject, if you will, for being applied like an ethnic and social studies subject, but rather it is woven in all aspects of the student's experience. And that's where the broader considerations for recommendations to EQS came in. And they felt very importantly that it wasn't a sort of siloed category of learning, but rather how the learning happens.
So, and I understand, I mean, the Act 1 group had very, very broad discretion under Act 1, and I fully support that. And I think, you know, to the extent that, you know, they trained their focus on the EQS, I think I can, you know, understand that as well. But we're still constrained by the statutory backbone of 16 VSA 165, which is the enabling statute that allows the state board to craft the EQS standards that are in Rule Series 2000. So whatever we do has got to comport with 16 VSA Section 165. And if it's not authorized by 165, because the EQS has to comply with 165, and if it doesn't, then we've exceeded our statutory authority.
So I think that's the I think I'm hearing that's an argument against option one. And that's certainly an argument that we talked about it as a committee. Tom, I want to get your voice in here.
Sure, thanks.
And I have comment as well. That was beyond that. I was just pointing to the Act One Working Group's authority for their recommendations to us. I think 164, I can't recall which section it is, but there's a responsibility within 164 as well for evaluation of equitable access to education. I apologize for my dogs, not quite sure why they're wanting to join me right now. It's hot in this room. I wouldn't want to be in here if I didn't have a choice. So the other piece that I want to point to is 16 VSA 1, which is the foundation of public education or education generally in Vermont, speaks to the right to a public education as integral to Vermont's constitutional form of government and its guarantees of political and civil rights. And it goes on, and then at the end it wraps up to say, therefore it's the policy of the state that all Vermont children will be afforded educational opportunities that are substantially equal, although educational programs may vary from district to district. So I think that foundational responsibility that Coach pointed to is well grounded in statutory authority, that the state has a responsibility for all students. EQS has been a vehicle for that, but regardless, the state has a responsibility for that right of all students. It's been borne out in Act 60, and I think that EQS recognizing the impact of legislation like Act 1 on how it's constituted is well within statutory authority. So,
but Section 1 doesn't grant rulemaking authority. 16 VSA Section 1 doesn't grant rulemaking authority. The rulemaking authority for EQS is in 16 VSA 165. The rulemaking authority for the independent schools is in 16 VSA 164.14. So we have to ground whatever rules we're making in a statute that authorizes us to craft those rules.
I think it's arguable that the vehicle of EQS came about as a construct to address the expectations for equitable access to education in Vermont. And I think beyond that, Act 1 takes that 16 VSA 1 and provides more clarity to what equitable educational access means, and therefore is like the original EQS lived in 1984 at a time when I'm pretty sure, and Tom checked me on my history here, where the traditional academies were considered public. Am I getting that right, Tom?
No, that's not right.
When were the traditional academies no longer considered public and became independent?
So the term public was used in some legislation or some documents back in the 80s. You're right, but they were never treated as public schools. They were never considered public schools. And the language did change in the 80s to recognize that.
Yeah.
And Tom, while you're talking, do you want to sort of jump in? I know you've had your hand up there a couple times.
So I want to go back to something Tammy said, is that our committee agrees that all students should be afforded these opportunities. And so we're not talking about whether or not this is a good idea for all students. We're not talking, that's not the issue. The issue, which regulatory framework should we use to get there? And we have one now that can work to get there. And I would argue just this point, and I don't know what we want to do with this, but if a public school is found not meeting education quality standards, let's just say one of them, they will be told that they need to improve, and it'll go into their continuous improvement plan, and they will get technical assistance to improve. And there's a process now in DQS, in QAR maybe, that we haven't seen yet, that might have some kind of teeth that would hold them accountable to meeting these standards. If we put these into 2200, like option 2 suggests, an independent school needs to meet these standards, and a lot of others since we revised 2200. And if they're found not meeting one of these standards, they don't get approved. They don't get any public tuition. They don't get a continuous improvement plan. They don't get another shot. So the accountability in 2200, I would argue, is more strenuous than it is in EQS. And if what we want is all kids to have these opportunities, that's a powerful way to get it. And I can speak from experience. That would be a driving force.
Tom, can I ask you a question on that? It's just something that I always have a hard time because I'm not the expert you are in the independent school rules. The 2200 series is titled Independent School Approval, right? Is there, and that happens at what, 3 or 5 year intervals, correct? So
Yes.
Is there a mechanism there, or could there be a mechanism constructed within that sort of framework where there's an annual something, you know what I'm saying, like, and we know we're behind on approvals, right? So there can be a lag or something along those lines. Can you help me understand? Like, that's just me trying to get my head around how that would work. And I know you've explained it to me before in the committee, and I'm still unclear. Sorry.
Yeah, so there's several options where this happens. One is just in when we vote on a motion to approve an independent school, there's always a paragraph that says if there's any changes in the current status in these areas, then you need to notify the secretary within 5 business days. So once you're approved under certain standards, if there's a change in any of those standards, then you need to report to the secretary. So that's one option. The other option is that we have already in 2200, and the mechanism for whatever reason did not work the way our subcommittee envisioned it, but a signed attestation by the school that they comply with these areas. And so that can certainly be expanded. For schools that are NEASC accredited, they, in their accreditation process, they also have a Vermont specific checklist that at the time that they are accredited, they at the site visit, they look to see if they are meeting these Vermont on top of the NEASC standards. And then every year, annually, the school needs to report on any significant changes, including the areas that would be covered by this, by the Act 1 changes. They and then they also write a 2-year interim report and then a 5-year interim report, although the process now is going to be only 5 years. So they'd write an interim report in between that is more extensive and may involve a site visit. So I just think in 2200, with the existing framework, we can get to where we want to go without overstepping what 165 already allows us to do.
Okay, thanks, Tom. Kim?
Thanks. So within the 2200 again, and thank you, Tammy, for clarifying, 2200 is an independent school program approval process. And that is about, the revisions came about as a result of the special education law 173, recognizing that all students have access, including students with disabilities. And so that will become effective July 1, but that prompted a lot of the rewrite of the work that we did. So when they need to attest, that is for new approvals or renewals. And we did purposely put that in, but there's no mechanism within 2200 to go back to a school that's already been approved for it to require them to sign the attestation. We just saw that in response from Dan that no, those schools have not done that. Some have voluntarily done it. And I think no more brought before us some that have voluntarily, that aren't up for renewal, completed that. But there's no mechanism in 2200. It's really about, are we allowing students to get through the door equitably? It isn't about the experience that they have once in the door. And the notification section, Tom, that requires reporting if something changes reads as follows. It's 2229.7, and it says, after receiving approval for public tuition, an approved independent school shall notify the secretary within a reasonable time of any significant changes to its special education program, professional staff, governance, financial capacity, or facility. There's no mention of any change in curriculum, no mention of any change in even enrollment practices. There's no mention of any changes that would need to be reported on in between their initial approval and renewal. And so really this 2200 is in fact what it's called. It's an approval process set of rules. Education quality standards are setting the expectations for what the ongoing learning environment is like for Vermont students. And that's where I feel as though if we are in agreement, and our committee really was, and even Tom was helping to inform which sections seem to be the appropriate sections. I had the opportunity to look back through all of our minutes because I was trying to put together our summary, a process sheet for you all. And one of our minutes captured our agreement that if we were going to apply these are the sections that are relevant to capture the work of Act 1 as it applies to all students. And so that being the curriculum content areas we spoke about, 2120.1 and 0.5. And those don't run amok of some of the other challenges, staffing, for instance, licensed staff, and governance concerns that I know is difficult for independent schools to imagine how they would comply with that because it's not in their, it is not in the way they do business necessarily. So
Jennifer, I see your hand, but before I turn to you, I'm also, this is a lot for, I'm sure, many of our state board colleagues to absorb. You can see the lively discussion and respectful discussions that we've had as a committee around this, and can see that we are trying to thoughtfully engage with this. But I also want to just recognize that, you know, we've all been sitting with this and thinking about this for several months, and we're throwing around a lot of technical detail here, which is also sort of this might be the first time that you're being introduced to all of this discussion. So I just want to sort of take it up to the treetops again and sort of flag for everyone that, like, our committee has been discussing the fact that there are, you know, again, we really feel that the principles and goals of Act 1 need to apply to all students, and really wrestling with the regulatory framework to do that. You can see sort of that there have been sort of two dominant ideas in that conversation. That does not mean that there isn't room for other ideas, and I want to sort of open that floor to the board. But I also want to make sure that we're introducing the bigger picture here. This is not the first or the last time we're going to talk about this with respect to sort of how we move forward and sort of keep the conversation up there. I see Jennifer's hand and then I see Lyle's hand.
Yeah, and I'll be quick. I was going to ask if, in addition to the materials that you guys have already sent to board members, if you can also send 16 VSA Section 164, as well as 16 VSA Section 165. Because I think that really does ground our conversation. And then furthermore, I think it would be really important to include the 2200 series, because you know, if we're discussing where and how to put these equitable ideas, I think it would be really helpful to see what's there. And to that point, 2223.9 does provide a mechanism for complaints and investigations. And so it's the secretary shall conduct an initial investigation of reports or complaints related to the approval standards and laws that apply to approved independent schools. That's pretty broad, and
Great.
it's there. So thank you.
Certainly can share that with everyone. And if in the course of this discussion, board members are feeling like, I wish I also had this at my fingertips, just put that in the chat and we'll get that out to everyone. Lyle, I saw your hand. I want to pull you into this conversation.
Thank you. Yeah, and you know, I oversimplify things, but at the end of the day, for me, I just want to make sure that approved independent schools, if they're getting money, they're following the rules. And so have we reached out to council to and probably done this, have we reached out to AOE council to say, where do you think we should put this in order to make that, get to that
Yeah.
end?
Yeah, so AOE Council has deferred on providing legal opinion on this rule set because they feel as if they administer these rules. We did secure independent counsel on this, and we do have an opinion on that, but I think we would need to talk about that in an executive session.
Okay, thank you. And when should we do that?
We can certainly set that up in our next meeting if that would be helpful to the board.
Let me ask a question. Do we have opportunity to move into that in this meeting, Jennifer? Or is that not?
I don't want to do that until people have a chance to look at that. And I would not want to do that without counsel here.
Okay, that makes sense. Neither are in conflict is what we can say. We didn't choose illegal language.
No, there's nothing problematic, I guess, in that regard with respect to the conversation we're having. But in our first couple slides, we have been engaged with counsel who has reviewed the rule up through sort of our last iteration. It will need to be reviewed again, top to bottom, before it's filed with ICAR, but it didn't make sense to do that until we had a decision on this particular point, because this could have real bearing on that final review. So, but I don't think that's an oversimplification, Lyle, right? Like, I think what I'm hearing you say is consistent with what I think the committee has said all along, which is all means all, right? And what we're struggling with, and I think struggling in a good way, is trying to figure out the regulatory framework that's most appropriate within existing statute so that what we do sticks, right? The risk is if we are outside of statute, outside of our guardrails, then it may not stick. And that would be really disappointing, at least to me, after all the work and I firmly believe that all means all, right? And I heard you say earlier you wanted to stick to. So I think we're trying to figure out, like, how do we create a regulatory framework within the existing strictures of statute so what we do sticks. Jenna?
So I'm thinking that, is there any other spots that independent schools have to follow the same thing that public schools follow that aren't in their rules? I mean, aren't in their independent school approval. So I think like the 2200 series lays out the have-tos for independent schools. And if it's there, you do it. I'm trying to think, is there anything else that they have to do that doesn't sit there? So
yes. The answer is yes. There are some things in the EQS that they are required to do. For example, around hazing and bullying, the statute.
That's in there.
That's in 2200. Okay,
Yep.
Sorry. I thought that one was not, because I thought my understanding was in our conversation and committee that was not. So I apologize.
Okay, I'm not double checking, but I'm pretty sure it's there because it's one of the things that show up in the report. It's a have to.
So Tom, I'll defer to you then.
I can I have it up on my screen. I just hadn't.
Yeah. Tom,
Yeah,
is there anything?
So I don't, off the top of my head, I'm not going to pull up like where it is. I know that there is broad language about compliance with applicable state and federal laws. I know that language is in there. And I know that when we get the report from the visiting team from the agency, that's a headline. That's a heading. So I know that that's part of their approval process.
So I guess my whole point, my point of my thinking is that if we want independent schools to follow and to do that, the mechanism has been the 2200, right? Like that's where that lives for them currently.
Currently, that is correct. That is correct. I see Mohammed, and then Kim.
Yeah, I'm referring to a draft here. I am on page 32, and it talks about 16 VSA 165. And it's clear.
Mohammed, could you clarify when you say draft, are you talking about the EQS rule or so? I just want to be clear so we're all looking at the same thing.
Let me go back to the top of the title, sorry. A long document here. It says, it's dated 4/11/23.
Okay, so Mohammed is looking at the most recent version of the EQS rule that was shared with the board. Thank you, Mohammed.
And that's page 32, if you have access to it.
Are you looking at the history and statutory authority?
I think so.
Okay.
I'm just referring to a lot that had been said, especially by Tom as well, but it's just, and Tom referred to it from the 200s, but this is from 2100s. I am just curious of what the difference is, whether we are still out of our guardrails or not, reading these lines. I'm still scrolling back to my 32. Yes, it says, regulates the process for an independent school to be designated as meeting education quality standards, as well as the provision of technical assistance if the state board finds an independent school not meeting the standards or failing to make progress towards meeting the standards. But my question is, there's a red line on the left, if you can see it, and I'm curious whether this aligns to the statutes we were referring to, so we know what to decide or what to waive for independent schools around the new changes we are discussing.
I think we're down. I think we're down in statutory authority, right? And I think that red line is there because we added 906 in 2019 Act 1 because that was what compelled the opening of these rules. Was the Act 1, directive to ensure the educational experiences are anti-racist, anti-discriminatory, and so I think to clarify just that single point, the line is there because we added that statutory authority because that was really the impetus for opening the rules. And I'm just looking if I can see where else. I think where you're speaking about the process for independent schools who choose to comply with EQS, Thetford Academy is one of those, and they have historically, they've served as the Thetford area high school for many years now. And so they have elected to comply with EQS and all aspects of it, actually. And so I think what it's laying out there is if they should fail to remain in compliance, there's a process that is, I think the agency provides technical support, and if they continue to not comply, then it eventually would come before the state board, as would be the case if a public school is not delivering on their requirements under public education and needs technical correction, and then they get technical support and then they still don't. We may get before us a request from the agency to realign supervisory district boundaries, for instance, to sweep in a school that is not able to do their job in educating students, whether they are public or a private that is electively choosing to apply with EQS. That's complicated for people who've been sitting here for a couple of years, much less for somebody who's joining us for our first meeting. So I apologize. I don't know that I can simplify it anymore, but I know what you're looking at. And that single paragraph is referring to independent schools that are electing to comply. So it's a little bit different category.
Thank you very much for the
You're
clarification.
welcome.
Mhm.
I think I'll just.
Sorry, I might be when I said other questions for folks for the committee on sort of the conversations we've had around whether to apply, how to apply.
I just, if it's okay, I did just want to sort of reflect on Jenna's thoughts and I think the challenge that, and I'm sure it's evident sort of where we were thinking and how we were falling on these questions. And I think perhaps the largest challenge is that putting these standards of the experiences that a student has within their schools for all Vermont students in a place that is about an independent school being approved or reapproved every 3 to 5 years feels much less directive, and the obligation of individuals to complain, to have it be elevated for response from the agency as revoking the privilege just feels like the wrong vehicle, in that we've got a vehicle that offers standards that are ongoing expectations for all Vermont students. And I think that we have a more direct path to aligning those with course of study and 16 VSA 1 and Act 1's directive in the vehicle that we have available to us currently, in those sections that we recognize are invoking the demands and expectations of the Act 1, as Coach helped us understand and as we read it ourselves. So I guess I think for my sake, that means it doesn't live in just an approval or renewal process. It must have a place otherwise. And we saw with the attestation that the agency doesn't view there to be a way to be seeking attestation after approval for something that we expected was effective last May, which is the public accommodations attestation for those that have already been approved. The agency doesn't believe there's a mechanism for their asking for those, is what Dan told us. So we're looking to put something in here that doesn't seem to have a mechanism currently either.
Tom, do you want to jump in? And then I thought maybe we'd wind this conversation down for today. I know this is a lot for the board to take in, but it won't be the last conversation. But Tom, do you want to jump in?
Thanks. So in a public school, because I've just seen this happen and we've seen this happen, the way that their accountability happens around something like this is also through a complaint process. And so it wouldn't be that different of a process. And I go back to arguing that the stakes for independent schools complying with this are considerably higher. In that there would be some schools, if they didn't comply with this, they would be out of business. The idea that there could be standards in 2200 and even rename the rule, if the name of the rule is an issue. But to open up 2200 and to insert this language and these expectations in there would not require us to change any statutory framework. We already have the ability to do this. And so that's my point. If we want to do it, this is how we do it. And I think it's a choice by the agency whether they create a mechanism to get these attestations. I think Vermont Independent School Association found a way to do it. And our expectation was that the agency was going to find a way to do it. So I think that there can be a way to do it. And if that's missing in 2200, then that can be put in as well. I'm just advocating that we have the authority. We we can get where we want to go in the existing framework without having to insert independent schools in the education quality standards that have clearly in statute applied to public schools and independent schools who choose to comply with them.
Kim, one last comment, and then maybe we can shift a little.
A comment, and I think I want to ask what else, what other additional information folks want. But the comment is, I'm not sure, Tom, you say we can just put it in 2200, and I'm not sure where the statutory authority is to, we have an approval of independent schools process. I'm not sure that we have an ongoing monitoring legislated or statutory authority for ongoing monitoring in the way you're describing. And so I certainly find that section that is pretty limited about what must be reported to not offer that. And I'm not sure, frankly, from where in statute that exists, but I'm finding as much lacking in statutory authority to put an ongoing mechanism for compliance with the standards we're talking about, because we were in agreement that those essentially in 2120.1, 2120.5 were, and the definitions were all sections that we felt, in addition to the learning environment and these others which are already invoked and required, and federal and state, I forget, entitlement, those sections we were in agreement as a committee were the content that should apply. And I just am not seeing where the statutory authority is for us to create that out of an approval process and establish.
So I think that's a question that we just need to wrestle with as a group in our next conversation, right?
But I think in the interest of us moving this to a process where we will have the board ready to make a decision on this question, I'd like to hear from board members, what do you need for us to explore further, understand differently, create inquiries of others, whether legal or otherwise, to have the information you need to feel equipped to decide on this point. And
I think Jennifer already requested that we send 16 VSA 164, 165, their 2200 series. So those
and
three immediate requests.
What
else?
I'm going to include 906.
906, okay.
906 and probably the other 1161, wherever the other ones are. The ones that we invoke in that.
906 does not confer rulemaking authority. So I don't think that you can pin any rules that we're contemplating on section 906.
The EQS rules have drawn out the minimum course of study pretty clearly, and I think it did so with the authority of 906. So I think, I'm going to send 906.
I was going to say, Jennifer, if that's part of sort of one side of the argument, let's send all the stuff out so people can read it for themselves. And so we can send 906 and 1161A, but that's just statute. I heard Lyle curious about legal opinion. We can arrange sort of to have a discussion around that, just not now, because we need to do that in a certain way. And I think we would want counsel here for that. What other kinds of questions or information? I know sometimes I don't even know what to ask until I've had time to sit with it a little bit. So if you're feeling that way, that's okay. Remember, we're going to have this question process coming in too, as you've read things. But if there are immediate questions or immediate information needs that have percolated through this conversation, if you share them with us now, we can be feeding that information back out to you. Thoughts?
I see hands, but I'm not sure if they are new or old. So I see
both Tom and Mohammed's hands have been perpetually up. So
I've been trying to get it down, I promise.
No worries.
I've been watching them wave. What they've done is they've waved. So I've been checking that out. All right. So I hope the full board can see again that the committee's thought a lot about this. We feel strongly, and our recommendations that that the principles and goals of Act 1 apply equally to students who attend public schools and those who go to approved independent schools. We're wrestling, and you can see the thoughtful discussion that's going on right now around how do we do this within the regular existing, how do we do this within statute? How do we come up with the appropriate regulatory framework? And so that's going to be something we are asking you all to read into and think about over the next week. But with that, it's 3:10. And you know, it's a gorgeous day outside. So
I just, Tammy, I just want to say that we have, I don't know, Jen, or maybe somebody can tell us, we have a public comment warned for 3:45. So I don't, and I know Jen had some things she needed to add to the
I know,
end, so
I was going to move on to that. I was actually going to move on to Jennifer's next issue, which is.
I just want to make sure, did we leave space? Does anybody have anything else specific that would be helpful to resolve or consider this question for you all, or suggestions for any clarity we might seek from the legislature as they have rules around independent schools receiving public tuition open right now, around a bill on this topic. So we've been focused on our rules. I think that is just a question. I truly haven't thought about it. All right, if I do want to think about timing, Tammy and Jennifer, for an executive session, and a goal, I think a very important goal that these rules have had a decision on them by this board, because remember, we're pre-filing, and thank you, Jennifer, for finding the right words. We're pre-filing, and we have space and time, and Richard, thank you for reminding us there's still space and time where we will get feedback and be responsive as we perfect, if you will, these rules. So with a goal that these are passed out of the State Board of Ed by the May meeting so that we can get them into the ICAR process and open that window, with the thought that if these were to be effective, the bulk of them for July 1, 2025, school districts need time to be budgeting for the resources to prepare themselves and their educators to deliver on these promises. And that is sort of the impetus for our ensuring we've moved this with adequate time for districts to be responsive and planning and preparing to be implementing for July 1, 2025. Okay.
So let me just say, if you are giving board members until April 24th to get back to you with comments, and then I'm assuming that the committee is going to meet at least
Sometime
once
that week,
to process
yeah.
that. I think the next step is that the subcommittee meets, processes the comments, and gets a, stable draft. I don't want to call it a final draft because it's not a final draft, but gets a stable draft out to the board with ample time for the board to review it before we meet. That's the time frame that I'm looking at, and if that coincides with the May meeting, great. If we have to warn a special meeting, great. We can do that too. I think it's really more important to build in the time and give people the opportunity to review these things so that we can have a thoughtful discussion about it.
I think your timing makes sense, which is, we get comment on the 24th, we'll get a subcommittee meeting to respond to those, get materials back out. I think the question that is outstanding, and I don't know that we need to do calendaring with the full group on the call, but if we wanted to have another in-depth meeting where we brought in counsel or something along those lines, independent of the May meeting, leave the May meeting for a vote, but have another discussion-oriented meeting without people having to make a vote at that meeting, we could try to do something before the May meeting. I think there's a little bit of a window there to do that, but let's get together and calendar that out. But I think we should definitely plan on, there will be another subcommittee meeting, there will be another round of drafts. At a minimum, there will be a conversation at the May meeting. We may try to get another special meeting before that so that we can have a little bit more time and space for discussion without warning a vote, so people can ask more questions and things along those lines. So, Richard, I see your hand.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I'm kind of in alignment with you. I think this would not be voted on at a special meeting, would it? This would be voted on one of the regularly warned meetings.
I think that makes sense. Yeah, I think the idea would have this be voted on at the May meeting, but I will signal that I certainly have found the conversation today really valuable, and it seems as if after the subcommittee responds to questions and gets a draft together, it may make sense to have another one of these discussion kind of meetings that give people the ability to ask and answer questions. And if people need more time to vote, to think about how they want to vote, then they have that opportunity. But to Kim's
It won't
point,
require 4 hours.
no, that's right. But to Kim's point, Richard, there is some sensitivity around wanting to get this into the ICAR process in June, just because of the implementation schedule for school districts, and wanting to be sensitive to the fact that this will impact how school districts start to think about their operations and their budgets for the following year. And so to get it in much later than that really starts to raise questions about whether or not the implementation timeline still works. So if we can all commit to trying to come to some resolution by the May meeting, that would be really helpful, I think.
Yeah,
And
'cause
the-
my only comment was gonna be, is that I would really like to see us maybe, if at our meeting next week, if we could kind of set a date that we plan to vote on it, even if we have to postpone that, at least that gives a lot of warning to people.
Yeah, I think I think that's fine. I think I think we can talk about it as a committee, but in my sense is that we should be thinking in our back of our heads right now that we're going to try to vote on this in May. I don't see a reason why that couldn't happen.
And I think I appreciate your concern for it being at a regular meeting, Richard. It is hard for board members and the public to be able to think about big decisions happening in an off cycle. So completely understand that concern. And I think a main meeting vote, the May regular board meeting vote, is important. And I am believing, and I want to check with you, Tammy and Tom, if comment doesn't come in until the end of the day on the 24th, I would expect we need to meet and be able to get materials back out to the board by the end of that week.
Yeah.
And that sounds reasonable to folks.
So I'm not back in the States until the 29th.
Oh, I thought you were back the 24th, Tom.
No,
Oh, okay. We will figure out calendaring offline and make this all happen. I don't know that taking up people's time on calendars would make sense.
I
So
think timing for return of materials, though, is still appropriate.
24th is still fine.
So that
everybody needs to get their stuff to us by the 24th.
If there are other people we need to inquire of to get responses, Tammy and I can do that and get that done before Tom gets back. But yes, and then we will at next week's meeting maybe have been able to calendar ourselves and think about if we were going to target the potential for another singularly focused special meeting like this, not for a vote, but rather for any clarity that you all feel would be helpful from our feedback and what we would return to you all. Maybe we can come up with a date for that as well, so people have time.
Great. All right. Lots of good thinking, lots of good discussion. Thank you to everyone for your active participation. And, it certainly has been a pleasure to work on this committee. It's important work. I do want to recognize that Jennifer had added something to the agenda. And so I think we have some time to discuss that. Two things, I'm sorry. Yeah, the board
Can I take
announcement.
the gavel back?
Yeah, I'm giving it back to you. That's what I'm trying to do. Back to you, Jen.
All right. Well, thank you guys. And thank you for leading a very thoughtful, in-depth, clear as it can be conversation. So I think once we all have time to kind of sit with this, I think, the next round is going to be even better. So, but I really appreciate the work that the committee has done to distill a lot of really dense information and present it in a way that makes sense. So thank you. Props to you all. Okay, so I've added one agenda item, which is I have been asked to testify before the Senate Ed Committee on H-483. And this is the House bill that was voted out and is now before the Senate Ed Committee with regard to independent schools. So I mentioned earlier, and I have also emailed the Senate Education Committee to be clear that I do not feel that it's appropriate for the state board to opine on policy. I think that's something for the legislator to wrestle with we are clearly told by statute that we are not supposed to be engaging in policy decisions. So I'm not interested. I don't think it's appropriate to opine on policy behind H483. What I do think would be helpful, and I'm sort of capitalizing on the fact that we're here today, is we have discussed two specific issues that I think I would like to be able to bring before the Senate Ed Committee. One is the idea that as a condition of approval to receive public funds, an independent school would need to be accredited by a third party, such as NEASC or ASNE. So that's the New England Association, what is it? New England Association for of Schools and Colleges, or the Association of Independent Schools in New England. So that would be, something that this board has talked about before that I think, and Kim, I see you, but hold on, please, that I think would be helpful in terms of providing some sort of, framework to the work that we're doing. I think the benefit of that is that it would free up the agency, it would free up the board, it would allow this work to be done by organizations that are in the business of doing this. They know what they're doing, they're working with schools. And I think it would really streamline from our end the work that we're being asked to do. And then the second thing that I would like to suggest to the Senate Ed Committee is, again, this is something that we've discussed, an annual attestation to compliance with the provisions of our Rule 2200 series, that they would add that as a statutory requirement. So going forward, this would be an annual requirement for independent schools as a condition of receipt of public funds. Kim?
And I think the most recent version did not have any requirement for accreditation.
Correct.
Okay.
It had been in a prior version. It's something that the board has discussed, and if the board was in favor of that, I would bring it back as something that the board thinks would be helpful.
I would say I don't know if we're taking a straw poll, but I don't think that's a responsibility that can or should be delegated as a requirement for independent schools. And I do think, though, an area that I think would benefit from conversation and their consideration is effective July 1 of this year. Those three categories has me wondering what our job is in approval that doesn't carry public tuition. So why are we still in the business of having to approve schools if they're not approved to receive public tuition effective July 1? That is a tremendous resource on the AOE and our board for approval that doesn't, it results in the exchange of public dollars. Why? It used to mean something, right? An approved school as opposed to a recognized school was whether or not you had public dollars allowed to flow to you. Come July 1 of this year, that no longer means anything.
Well, my understanding was that it had more to do with the curricular requirements, where there's, a recognized independent school is just recognized as operating, but there aren't the same level. I mean, the entire 2200 series doesn't apply to a recognized independent school. Those standards would still apply to an approved independent school, whether or not it's receiving public tuition. So I think there is something of value to the approval process.
No, understood. I just wonder what our interest is as a state in those things anymore, because it really only has the effect of recognizing. So a student attending a recognized school or a student attending approved school July 30th of this year is in both cases not truant, and that's it.
I guess I don't agree with that, because I think the standards in 2200 are, much greater than not truant. And I think there's a difference between complying with the standards in 2200, regardless of whether or not you're receiving public funds, versus being a recognized school.
But where we no longer have a financial interest as a state, what is the benefit to the state in inserting ourselves in a process that is not about whether or not we are providing public dollars for a student to attend?
I believe it still has to do with the level of oversight. Tom, I don't know if you want to jump in here.
No, I was gonna respond to a different, I was just gonna make a point, but it's not an answer to Kim's question. I want to think about that. We all are familiar with a case where, the situation where a political entity doesn't, does or does not have rules for approving schools. So if we only have the two categories, there would be a whole set of schools that currently would like to be approved and would like to meet those standards on behalf of their students and families, who then wouldn't have that option. But to Kim's question about what's the state's interest, I want to think about that. So that was going to be my comment, but I need to think about the answer to the question.
Yeah, thank you, Tom. Because my question becomes, do we not assume liability while not having an actual responsibility for it? And we know the resources that approval has expended purposely and intentionally for the accountability to public dollars. And I just, because students can attend a recognized school or an approved school and not receive public dollars effective July 1 of this year, I'm just wondering, in the category of maybe business we get out of, is that one that makes sense? I appreciate it might mean something from a marketing standpoint to the independent school, but I'm not sure that I will see where it continues to mean something to the state of Vermont.
So let me just say, I mean, the 2 points that I had identified are things that we have discussed in prior board meetings. This is a completely different conversation.
I'm just saying, like, I don't want to weigh in. I don't want us to say we defer to any accrediting agency, because I don't think that I was saying we have a compelling state interest in approving those schools for which we are sending public tuition. And we've had this now 3 bucketed category of schools for July 1. So personally, I started by saying personally, I wouldn't support the state board weighing in on accreditation being a better path, because we don't want to be burdened with the responsibility of having to approve. I think our approval needs to be incredibly rigorous where it comes to where we're sending our public dollars. And I think we need to consider if that continues to be a necessary level of rigor where it isn't about our public dollars. I think that's an interesting conversation to let the legislature opine on. Like, it is a use of our resources that I think we should consider its value moving forward.
Other board members?
Well, if I'm following this correctly, I think I heard us agree that yes, the attestation piece is something that we all agree with. Am I correct? Because you had 2 points, the second being the attestation. I sense that we all agree with that as a concept, do we not? That was a straw poll. Okay.
Yeah. No, I think it.
At the first question, I wonder if having the associations or organizations approving the independent school is something that we are discussing. Do we want Jennifer to bring that up as this is something we're discussing as a future option? And maybe it's one option, not the only option.
I would agree, Lyle, that may make sense if we're pointing to the 2 areas where we're seeing the lack of 2200 having an annual attestation and the lack of clarity around whether or not approved independent schools to receive public tuition should comply with, any part of ACT, any part of EQF. I think it would be fair to let them know that those are questions under consideration, because if we're asking them just to fix the attestation thing and we think it requires legislative authority to do it, and we're otherwise debating that we think it requires legislative authority to require compliance with those sections that are Act 1, especially Act 1 related through EQS, they may choose the policy of which direction they wish to go in that, but those are 2 areas we're finding inadequate to address this question right now, or to come to consensus on this question, I should say.
On the accreditation question, Lyle, I get, or Jennifer, just a reminder of that conversation is that it does save state resources. It would require resources that maybe some small schools don't have. So it's not a cheap process. It's a rigorous one, but it's not cheap. So that, just to throw that in, that it's a good process, and I believe in it, and I believe in it for a lot of reasons. But that is one downside, is small schools find it hard to do.
So, and the unintended consequences of sometimes bringing up something is that then legislators think that that's the direction they're going to go, and they grab a hold of it and run with it. So is now the time we want to bring that up? And I'm not saying it's not, but is now the time we want to bring that up?
Because already it's a pathway to approval for schools that choose it.
But I think, wasn't the question, Jennifer, like, so if it was already a pathway, and if they have let go of that consideration, because at least the testimony I listened to from House was that they felt as though it was a delegated authority that should remain, it shouldn't be a requirement. It's fine that it's a possible pathway for those who choose it, but it shouldn't be a requirement. I'm not sure what our interest is in weighing in on a subject they seem to have moved on from.
Well, the House has moved on from it. I don't know about the Senate. So just a
Well, it's
question.
not in the bill that went over, though, I guess.
Correct, right. So the House dropped it, but I'm testifying before Senate Ed. So the other thing to keep in mind is that last year we basically stripped out the Rule 7000 series, which for new board members, it was kind of an old rule series that really didn't have any substantive content in it. It cited statutory reference. And so it was literally like there was the topic, and then there was a statutory reference, and then there was a topic, and there was statutory reference. There wasn't really any meat in the Rule 7000 series, with the exception of it listed out probably 8 different accrediting agencies that were recognized by the state board. And this came up when the 2200 series was open a year ago, and Kim and Tom and I were on that subcommittee. And we thought, the first thing we noticed is that list was, I don't even know how old it was, but some of the accrediting agencies that were listed in that Rule 7000 series don't even exist anymore. So it was clearly old. I think we're all getting a sense of just how laborious it is to open up a rule series. And what we thought would be a better approach is to maybe craft a framework and say, if you want to be an accrediting agency recognized by the State Board of Ed, this is the framework that you need to comply with. So that work would still need to be done, where we would have to, and in the meantime, like we're sunsetting out the Rule 7000 series, we have it listed in the 2200 series that we recognize NEASC and ASNE, the two that I mentioned earlier, as accrediting agencies. So either we are going to need to do the work to create this framework that we discussed, or if by statute, the legislature requires, NEASC or ASNE accreditation as a condition of approval to receive public funds. To my mind, that has a few benefits. One is it creates a higher level of review than I think the Agency of Education is able to do. It, to Tom's point, conserves state resources because the agency and the state board subcommittee aren't doing that work now. There could be a Vermont specific rider that would include any information that we want to be on there. And it wouldn't be like, if we wanted to update that language, we would be able to update it. We wouldn't have to update a rule series to do it. So those were the benefits that I was seeing of, asking the legislature to do that. But, we can take a vote and I can be outvoted. Kim, final comments, and then I'm going to move on because I know that we have other things to talk about.
I don't know that we need a vote. I would just say I would strongly disagree with us weighing back in on shifting the responsibility for approval, because I really think the value in saving resources would be in focusing attention on approving those that are eligible to receive public tuition, and that otherwise become a marketing seal of approval without any real effect on what it means for the benefit, what it means for the differentiation among our approved schools at all between that one and the other, because they receive no additional benefit. There's no, conserving resources by off-sourcing to a 10-year cycle through an accreditation process with private organizations at the expense of any independent school having to be required to do it seems, I would be strongly against us weighing in on that topic. And it's fine if we don't want to say, by the way, we don't really need 3 categories of schools anymore. That's fine. It sounds like we haven't had enough of discussion on that. But we also have, I see no place for us in a conversation around requiring a private accrediting agency. And I see risk in us bestowing a blessing on only 2. There are Christian accrediting agencies. There are smaller accrediting agencies. There are those outside of New England. I think we run tremendous risk and liability in offloading that responsibility. Thanks.
Jenna.
Did you see Jenna?
Sorry, got lost.
Oh, Tom was ahead of me, I think. Is his hand still?
Oh, no, that's my enduring hand. Sorry.
Oh, good. Okay. My 2 cents here is I would agree with him in the sense of, because what Tom said around it's an equity issue as well. We have smaller schools that are approved in Vermont that have very, very small budgets, and they serve a unique population of learners sometimes, and they would not be able to go through this and have a budget to support that process. Also kind of brings me back to the thinking about how up in, what was it? I want to say Halifax, New Brunswick, right? We're approving the student and thinking about students who are at independent schools that are not, or what are they, recognized, right? So recognized, not approved. And that's how you're watching all students, right? So I don't know what the role is looking at all students if we're not looking at all schools.
Okay. So with that in mind, I will move that the State Board of Education authorize me to represent to the Senate Education Committee that the board is in favor of requesting independent schools to complete an annual attestation of compliance with the Rule 2200 series as a condition of their approval to receive public funds. There a second?
I would second that.
Thank you. Seconded by Lyle. Any further discussion?
I'm sorry, I got booted off for a second. I missed the motion.
So the motion is that the State Board of Education authorize me to represent to the Senate Education Committee that the board is in favor of requiring independent schools to complete an annual attestation of compliance with the Rule 2200 series as a condition of their approval to receive public funds.
Jennifer, were we going to make any mention of the secondary consideration that the lack of clarity regarding whether or not there's any part of EQS that would be applicable to independent schools by virtue of Act 1? I mean, I think if we're going to ask one, we ask both, right? We seem to be lacking clarity or differences of opinion on those questions, don't we?
Well, it's still before us. Mohammed?
Thank you. In addition to what Kim just brought up, which is a very good point as well, I am still slightly concerned about the accreditation piece. Who should be accrediting and based on what? Those are my questions. Based on what standards? I know about NIASC, our school district here at UNSK is in compliance with NIASC and getting our eyes open via their recommendations. It's very powerful, just like I believe Lyle mentioned. They can be very useful, but I'm just concerned of where are the limits, where are the guidelines on which institution should accreditate which school.
And to that,
Just to pick, yeah.
just to that point, just I remind the board that I do have I was asked to do research on that question a while ago about what standards they might be back when we had 2200 open, and I have an answer to that question about if we were going to set a set of criteria by which we evaluated accrediting agencies. I have an answer ready to go on that.
Okay.
Thank you for that. Thank you.
Okay. So let me, if it wasn't clear, I'm going to drop the whole question about being third-party accredited because I'm not hearing, wild support for that idea. To Kim's question, would it be appropriate for me to acknowledge that the State Board of Ed is currently engaged in discussions to figure out how to apply the provisions of Act 1 to independent schools that are seeking to receive public funds?
That would be fair. I like that better than the previous question. I think that raises the issue and can get feedback on it.
Okay, so hold on. Move that the State Board is engaged with discussions or in discussions to consider how best to implement the provisions of Act 1 to independent schools that are seeking to receive public funds.
Jennifer, just as a procedures person, you have a motion and a second on the floor. You can't have another motion and a second until you dispose of the previous one.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I thought we'd voted on that, but that would be me at 4
No,
o'clock.
because I
with no lunch.
interrupted you. I asked a question, I thought, and then I got you off track, so I'm taking
Yeah.
the fault for
No,
it.
thank you. Thank you for keeping me on track. Okay, so I've read the motion about the attestation clause. Do I need to reread the motion? Or do we all know what the motion is? I'll just reread it. What the heck? I move that the State Board of Education authorize me to represent to the Senate Education Committee that the board is in favor of requiring independent schools to complete an annual attestation of compliance with the Rule 2200 series as a condition of their approval to receive public funds. It has been moved. It has been seconded. Is there any further discussion? Hearing none. All those in favor, please raise your hand and signify by saying aye.
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 All those opposed, please raise your hand and signify by saying nay. Hearing none. Any abstentions? Okay, the motion has carried unanimously. Okay, and I will further move that the State Board of Education, I move that the State Board of Education authorize me to represent to the Senate Education Committee that the board is engaged in discussions to consider how best to implement the provisions of Act 1 to independent schools that are seeking to receive public funds.
I would second that as well.
Okay. Any further discussion? Hearing none. All those in favor, please raise your hand and signify by saying aye. Aye.
Aye.
All those opposed, please raise your hand and signify by saying nay.
That's it. Aye. Sorry.
Thank you. Any abstentions? Okay, the motion has carried unanimously. Okay, thank you. And then next on the agenda, this was the other thing that I added, 2 quick board announcements. I know that Tom and Lyle and Amara will not be available to attend our monthly meeting next week, which again, as a reminder, will be held in person at the Central Vermont Career Center in Barrie. And I just want to ensure that the remaining 7 of us will be attending in person because I just want to make sure that we're going to have a quorum. So is anyone else other than Tom, Lyle, or Amara not planning to attend the meeting or not able to attend our monthly meeting next week?
I plan to attend, but if we get 4 more feet of snow, you ain't seeing me.
You have 4 more feet of snow, you won't see me either.
Yeah, well,
We'll
actually,
be
that's
going
me too.
south.
Just to confirm, we're anticipating that meeting will end at 3:45. That's
If
what I
not
see.
earlier.
Okay.
Yeah.
I will have a pretty hard stop then to get back for kid pickup.
Great. Okay. Well, and I have to get to Albany, New York for 7 o'clock to pick up a kid from an airplane. So.
And I'm sad that we won't see Amara because it's her school, right?
Well, she will be coming to the tour.
Okay.
When we meet at 11, we're going to start with the tour, and she will be there for that. But then she's got clients in the afternoon, so she'll miss the actual meeting. So, if anyone's plans change, please let me know because again, I just want to make sure that we're going to have a quorum. And then on that note, for those of you who are attending, Maureen really needs your lunch orders because they're due tomorrow. So please make sure to get that in.
That was the easiest thing I did all week. I was pretty excited about it. I know we don't have it. Maybe we can just do an announcement about it, but there will be 2 open student positions coming up. And maybe that's something just at the beginning of the next meeting. Jen, Amara's stepping down because she's graduating. So we will have a position that'll be a 1-year and then a 2-year as well, both open for students.
Correct. And then the other thing is because Amara is stepping down, the student who fills her space will be completing that 2nd year of her term and will therefore be eligible to vote.
And I wonder, how do we get that information out to student groups or like through VPA, or is there something I can do to help?
I think the agency sends out that information.
Okay.
Is that appointment by the governor also?
Yes.
Yeah.
But yeah, to that point, if anyone knows any students who they think would be a good fit, I would encourage them to contact the governor's office.
Yeah, I've been circulating it to juniors and seniors that I know.
Passed it around as well. I think what I'll do is just pass the information along to the students who've come before us from the SARN as well, which Vermont Students Anti-Racism Network. And there are few and far between statewide student organizations in that way, and they don't have their own VSBA or VSBE, unfortunately. So I'm trying to think of any other statewide student organizations might be helpful, or the VPA asking them to pass it along through their high schools would be helpful too. I could probably do that. I'll copy you, Jennifer, if that's okay. I'll send information that those seats are open with the link to where the governor has it sitting on his website.
Okay.
And then I'll copy you.
Great, thank you. Lyle? Wait, you're muted.
Talking to myself again. I apologize for a 4 o'clock hard stop here, but I don't want to miss public comment. So I don't know if that's coming up next or not.
That is, well, I was just going to wrap it up and see if there were any other board announcements, but we are at the stated time for public comment. So if there are no other board announcements, then we will move on to public comment. So hearing no other board announcements, if there are any members of the public who wish to speak, raise your hand, please, by hitting *5. Okay, I see someone ending in 6322. You can push *6 to unmute yourself. Oh, and I think in fairness, since we started public comment at the beginning of the meeting with a 1.5-minute limit, I would ask that the same rule apply here. So as soon as you identify yourself, Tammy, I think, is keeping track of time.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi, everybody. This is Amanda Garces, Director of Policy, Education, and Outreach for the Vermont Human Rights Commission. I just want to, I'm also aware of the excellent working group. I want to thank the subcommittee for all the work that it's doing to get us there. Tomorrow will be 1 full year since we gave our recommendations. Our recommendations were based on our roles to look at state board rules, which makes, align with the work that we're constantly doing right now, which is looking at the content standards and which will be sending for recommendations in a couple of months. So I just want to thank everybody. I really hope that this can move forward and that we really do consider how this will apply to independent schools that receive public funds, so that students in all over Vermont have the possibility to live in a society that is full of people of color and full of other people and learn from their experiences. I am discouraged by some testimony before around we don't need to learn about ethnic groups, that the problems in Vermont is all about class. And I just want to really move this work forward for our students who are really wanting this and deserving of this. So thank you for your time again, and thank you for your due diligence and to moving this forward.
Thank you.
And you're within time.
Any other members of the public who wish to be heard? And you can raise your hand by pushing *5. Right. I'm not seeing anyone else, so I think this brings us to the end of our meeting. And with that, I will entertain a motion to adjourn.
I move to adjourn.
Moved by Tammy, seconded by Kim. Any further discussion? Hearing
Everybody
none.
get outside and enjoy that sunshine.
All those in
Look at
favor,
the
please raise your
chickens.
hand and signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed? All right, we stand in adjournment. Thank you.
Thanks. Hey, thanks everyone
all.
for hanging in here and doing this special meeting today. Really appreciated it. Thank you.
And thank you for being